looks fair. Now, if the tier one data starts to show things weakening further, then at that, we may be looking to go long duration. I think rates look very fair here. What we've been doing, though, is moving up in quality. So within our credit spectrum, trimming a little bit of high yield, moving up in quality investment grade, just because with uncertainty, maybe it stays in the uncertainty mode. Risk premiums should be higher, and we should get paid to take that extra risk, which we don't think you're getting paid necessarily in every segment of the market. So we're looking at the portfolio, particularly the credit part of the portfolio, very closely, moving up in quality, making sure that the companies, the sectors we own, are less sensitive to some of the headline risk that's out there. So just doing more of that credit work, but staying with it. I think we're in a soft landing. And so, when the 10-year was closer to 4.5, it was attractive to own duration. I think at this point, we can be neutral duration and be careful with the spread product that we're buying.
The administration is talking about tax cuts. Can I ask you how much in tax cuts can this bond market stand?
I'm glad you bring that up. I think the expectations of tax cuts were much higher a month ago. And I think the market realized that the administration has a constraint, both politically as well as a market constraint. And I think expectations of those tax cuts have come down. You see the House passed bill. Let's see what the Senate does with it. But I think our expectation is all we'll really get is an extension of the 2017 tax cuts. That's not net new stimulus. Now, that does increase the deficit, but I think that is priced into the bond market. So we're not expecting, and I think the market's priced for not a whole lot more in terms of tax cuts. I think we're going to spend all year trying to find those pay-fors, making sure that, we can at least just extend that 2017 tax cuts. I don't think we're getting any more tax cuts because, to your point, the bond market is going to push back. And we know the president, Secretary Besson, they care about the 10-year. They realize that the 10-year impacts the economy, it impacts risk assets. So I don't think they'll be able to get much because it's going to be tricky. Where do you get those spending cuts to offset? Just the extension of the TCJA is $4 trillion in deficit. So I think all we'll get is that extension, and I think that's in the market.
All right, Priya, thank you so much for joining us. Priya Misra, she's fixed income portfolio manager over there at JP Morgan Asset Management, joining us from New York City.
Did she just say I'm not getting a SALT tax deduction raised?
I think that's still on the table, but I don't know. We'll have to see. That's a lot of the tri-state lawmakers said, we're not voting for anything unless you put that SALT thing back in there to some degree. All right, folks, join us on Bloomberg Radio and Television at 3 p.m. today, Wall Street time. Bloomberg's David Weston speaks with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. That's 3 p.m. Wall Street time today. Again, looking at the markets, we still got some green on the screen here. The S&P 500 is up about 0.6%. Same for the NASDAQ. The Dow, same for the Dow. That's 270 points on the Dow Jones Industrial. Yields pretty steady here. Got the 10-year Treasury at 4.25%. Remember, just a few days ago, this thing was at 4.5, 4.6%. So a little bit pullback here in the yields. Bitcoin, it is now positive by 13 points, 84,300 on Bitcoin. We were at 78,000 earlier this trading session. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
to Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John Tucker sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. Mike McKee joins us, international economics and policy correspondent. Mike, you emailed me a few minutes ago. Atlanta Fed GDP now, Q1 to date, negative 1.5%. That seems like a wow figure to me.
And Priya Misra just said, forget about it.
I'll more or less second what Priya has to say. But the reason I emailed you, of course, is because earlier on the show you were asking me, could we see a negative number? Yes, because mathematically the trade number was so bad, a negative 153 billion, a record, that it mechanically pushes down the addition to GDP now. But GDP now is a snapshot in time. The best way to put it is sort of like asking somebody, what's the score in the sixth inning?
Right.
You know, okay. But we still have basically all of February's data to go and all of March's data to go that we don't have yet. So it will be significantly different by the time we get to the end of the quarter.
All right, so the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, whatever, pretty much expectations, met expectations, right?
No.
Not much movement there. Was there anything to see in that?
Not in the inflation numbers, really, but in the spending side of the numbers. It was extremely weak in January, down 0.2% after an 0.8 rise in December. And it raises questions, put it that way. Let's say the Washington thing. I'm just asking questions about where the consumer is going, because we've now since then seen these declines in the consumer sentiment numbers. However, remember, the weather was pretty bad in January. You went out and you spent all your money in December. You bought everybody nice holiday gifts, and then it's snowing and cold and miserable in places like New Orleans and Houston.
Yes.
It's just like, hey, I'm just going to stay home and watch football.
How's that measured? They call you up on the phone and say, how you feeling, consumer?
Essentially, the consumer sentiment indexes are sort of like that. The two who do it, the Conference Board and the University of Michigan, they have rotating panels, people who they call month after month while they're in the rotation, or in the Michigan now does it online, but basically they're calling, essentially calling and asking people how you feeling about things now. I mean, there's 100 different questions, but it all adds up.
All right, on any given week on this fine radio program, I'll interview, I don't know, just dozens and dozens of people. And I think over the last couple of weeks, I've heard more questions, concerns. We're going to keep our antenna up for slowing growth. That's kind of come into the conversation a little bit more that I've noticed. And that's just in the last couple of weeks. Are you sensing that at all? Are you seeing anything?
Oh, yeah. I am sensing the questions about it. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the weather, and everybody always gets depressed in the winter anyway. And the weather's been holding down economic activity. So you do have that. But then you have all this uncertainty that's brought about by the president. And so people are looking at what are the potential outcomes. And certainly one side of the potential outcome is a recession if tariffs or taxes or immigration goes south on us, then you could have bad news. And it's really hard to quantify the gains on the other side. The president says there will be, but he hasn't got any way to prove it. So people are just kind of weighing the two sides and at this point talking about, well, maybe things could be bad. But just talking about it at the moment.
Speaking of which, the president says the tariffs are going to bring big industries back to this country where they belong. Why did they leave in the first place?
Basically for cost reasons.
It's labor arbitrage, right, essentially?
Basically labor arbitrage. And it goes back to, the original David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all the idea of comparative advantage. If you can do the same thing cheaper or better somewhere else, why do it at home? Now, obviously, that's a theory. It works great in theory. It doesn't work so great with the people who were doing it at home and no longer have a job, which was something that kind of got lost in the overall macro view of it in the 1990s and 2000s. Everybody would say, well, this is great because look at the prices we're getting. All these things are cheaper. We can go on Amazon now. We can get everything so much cheaper than we did. And they weren't looking at the other side of it, that it cost people jobs and then that cost the economy income. And so now there's kind of a reversion of that. The problem is we have had technology gain at the same time as all of this is happening. And so to the extent that companies do come back, it's not to hire people, it's to put robots in their place. We saw that with what's happened since Trump's first term and during Biden's term is, you know, we did see a lot of companies come back, supply chains come in because of the pandemic, but it's not been a case of hiring a lot of people to fill those spots.
And if you want to, you know, you can get rid of backhoes and just give people spoons to dig holes. That would create a lot of jobs.
I think their best hope is New Jersey gas stations where you're not allowed to put your own gas.
Exactly.
All comes back to New Jersey.
It all comes back to New Jersey. Michael McKee, thank you so much. We appreciate it. International economics and policy correspondent from Bloomberg News. I don't know about you guys. March 1st is one of the most important days on my calendar every year because to me, it signals we've survived winter. It's done. It's in the rear view. We may get snow in March, but it's going to melt quickly. And for every colder day, you're going to get 2 warmer days. So March 1st tomorrow for me is big.
In like a lion.
Yep, absolutely. All right, good stuff. All right, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew is up next after this global news update. Thank you, John Tucker, for sitting in for Alex. Alex will be back on Monday. Have a good week. This is Bloomberg.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by Progressive Insurance.
I'm Steve Kathan. President Trump tells Ukraine's president at the White House that a ceasefire deal with Russia is close and a new U.S. minerals deal with Kyiv is very fair. CBS's Natalie Brand.
Zelensky has made clear that he wants continued military assistance and security guarantees to protect the sovereignty of his country as the Trump administration really tries to put pressure on Ukraine and Russia for this larger ceasefire deal.
President Trump has made much of the minerals agreement all this week. Gracelyn Bascaron is with the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
The final agreement is essentially an establishment of a fund. And the fund takes revenue generated by future mineral assets and puts them into a fund that can be used to fund investment in Ukraine.
The U.S. now has its hands on key Mexican drug cartel members, including one man who's been sought for decades, Rafael Caro Quintero. CBS's Nicole Skenga.
These 29 individuals, they were flown from just north of Mexico City. They're now detained at prisons in 8 different U.S. cities, some of them wanted in multiple states. They face charges including racketeering, drug trafficking, murder, illegal use of firearms, money laundering.
White House officials say President Trump is set to sign an executive order today that will make English the official language of the U.S. Texas health officials now report at least 146 measles cases. Other states have reported cases too. Business analyst Jill Schlesinger has the latest inflation news today.
The Fed's preferred inflation measure showed some progress. In January, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or the PCE, showed a 2.5% annualized rate of inflation.
Microsoft says it's shutting down Skype. The online voice and video call pioneer will vanish in May. More of the company's customers now use the Teams app or other services from other companies like WhatsApp instead. Overseas to Greece. Police using tear gas and stun grenades to combat protesters with gasoline bombs in some cities as they mark the second anniversary of a rail disaster that killed 57 people. Big day for 36-year-old English golfer Dale Whitnell at the South African Open, a round with 2 holes in 1.
Yeah, I've never had one in tournament play. I had one in Paris National a few years ago in practice round, but these are my first ones in hole in 1, and to have 2 in 1 day is pretty special.
Wall Street, right now the Dow is up 210 points, NASDAQ up 76. This is CBS News. Daycare is supposed to be a place of peace and safety. Not always. In California's Bay Area, one was filled with guns and drugs.
Vallejo Mayor Andrea Soares says she could hardly believe that a business believed to be a safe place for children was raided by federal agents.
One of the locations where they found 11,000 suspected fentanyl pills and $100,000 in drug cash was actually at a daycare location.
Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be deadly in an adult. A mother and son were arrested at the daycare in addition to 8 other individuals as part of a federal crackdown on drug and gun trafficking by criminal gangs. Matt Bigler for CBS News, Vallejo, California.
Boris Spassky, the Soviet chess champ who lost the world title to Bobby Fischer in a Cold War showdown in 1972, has died at 88. The stoic Spassky was a sharp contrast to the fidgety, bombastic Fischer. Steve Kathan, CBS News.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
President Zelensky gets an audience at the White House. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the two leaders meet right now in the Oval Office ahead of a joint news conference that we will bring you live from the East Room a bit later on today. We're going to go to the White House in a moment for an update with insights today from Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn. And with me here at the table, a conversation with Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. We'll look ahead to what form a peacekeeping force could take in Ukraine, assuming they can reach a deal. Rebecca Grant from the Lexington Institute will be here, along with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us for the hour. So let's get rolling right now. We're going to be hearing from President Trump and Zelensky when they wrap up their conversation in the Oval. Right now, it's Wall Street with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. PCE Day, Charlie. How's it look?
Indeed. Right now, we have got stocks higher across the board, Joe Matthew, with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ wrapping up a turbulent week with gains right to the numbers because we got the S&P now at 5880, still below 5,900, still below 6,000, up 18, a gain of 0.3%. Dow Industrials up 177 now, up 0.4%. NASDAQ higher by 65 for the NASDAQ Composite Index. That is a gain right now of just about 0.4%. And should point out that year to date, we do have the S&P 500 index showing a loss fractionally down 0.03% in the YTD column. 10-year yield 4.23% with a 2-year 4.00%. Spot gold down $28 the ounce, 28.48. That is a drop now of 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, 69.71 a barrel. And Bitcoin now at 84,037. Bitcoin down today by 0.3%. Peter Cheer is head of macro strategy at Academy Securities, and this morning on Bloomberg Intelligence, he told us he does see a bumpy patch ahead for the U.S. economy.
When you look at what DOGE is trying to do, it's going to cut some spending. That's going to hit immediately. Whether some of it was inefficient, fine, maybe that doesn't have an impact. But to the extent they trim anything that was efficiently being allocated, that hits. And then the jobs, even if people get laid off, are able to find jobs, which I'm questioning because I don't think the market's that great for jobs.
Peter Cheer of Academy Securities. BlackRock is scrapping its, quote, aspirational workforce representation objectives, reversing course on earlier goals after President Trump moved to end diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practices. BlackRock shares are up today by 0.6%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 0.4%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington as Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
On the last trading day of the month, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much, and happy Friday, Charlie. Thanks for meeting us here at the threshold of the weekend. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, channel 121. And on YouTube, where you can find us now. We're going to be showing you some cool stuff coming up as we bring you live to the White House. It'd be a good time to get on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. You'll see Tyler Kendall on the North Lawn. We do this for you every day live from Washington on the fastest show in politics. You can hear the program so many different ways, including our podcast that we always point you to on Apple, Spotify, wherever you do your podcasts. Find us on Balance of Power. So here's the TikTok on this Friday. It's beautiful out, by the way. Nice day in the nation's capital. You didn't see anybody shivering when President Zelensky arrived at the West Wing a short time ago. No coat for the boss today. They're in the Oval as we speak, all right? When they're done, and if you're with us on YouTube, you are seeing President Zelensky arrive at the White House. Quick hop over from the Hay Adams Hotel where he spent the night. This bilateral meeting in the Oval Office, and I have to admit, I'm looking at what we're hearing from reporters. You're probably seeing headlines on the terminal. I'm not sure this is going really well. We won't really know until we can hear these two and see the body language. But they're going to have a lunch in the cabinet room after this meeting, and then a news conference in the East Room. We'll bring that to you live. This is the full trappings of the visit here coming to fruition in a joint news conference. Now, as we wait for this conversation in the Oval, we can bring it to you on the air. We want to go to the North Lawn of the White House right now, where we find Tyler Kendall. This is something else, Tyler. I'm looking at the headlines. I don't get a sense that President Zelensky is terribly satisfied. What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, Joe, particularly since President Trump has said that they will sign that critical minerals deal later today. And he said that that is considered to be a big commitment from the U.S. But we've heard White House officials say that this is an implicit security guarantee, since the U.S. would have a vested economic interest in the country. But Zelensky said notably that he is looking for what else the U.S. will be bringing when it comes to guarantees. He knows what the Europeans are doing, but that a piece of paper, in his words, are not enough, and that he wants some of these firmer guarantees to come out of it. President Trump saying that they have already started the, quote, confines of a deal when it comes to negotiating with Russia, and also, importantly, was asked which side of this he is on, and he said he is for both Russia and Ukraine. He just wants to find peace for the countries. Of course, that goes against some rhetoric that our European allies have been saying when it comes to holding Russia accountable, and that could also be a potential point of contention in the Oval Office today, considering that Zelensky would like to see some firmer security guarantees from the U.S.
I don't know how you can even hear as you're speaking, Tyler. If you're with us on the radio, you can hear it. It's an incredibly busy day on the North Lawn. If we pulled the camera out, you'd see people on each side of Tyler, because we've got international press on the ground for this visit. It's a much more crowded campus than usual, Tyler, and I suspect a pretty tough East Room to get into later on. I know the clock seems to be broken here because they're running a bit late, but what are we going to expect in this news conference?
Right, well, those big questions about what sort of guarantees the U.S. could give. It appeared that President Trump floated that perhaps more arms could be going towards Ukraine's way. That is something that we know that Ukraine would want, but also our European allies. President Trump did make mention that he knows how critical air defense systems are going to be for the future of Ukraine. That is something that France and also the U.K. asked President Trump about when they were here at the White House, as they have floated this framework to get U.K. and French peacekeepers on the ground, but they want to see the U.S. underwrite that deal in some sort of way, including potentially providing those air defense systems. President Trump so far has sidestepped questions about directly what the U.S. would be willing to give, much to the disappointment of the Ukrainians so far. But our Bloomberg reporting indicating that this critical minerals deal is just really the first step, and that they are hoping to get a little bit more firmer guarantees moving forward.
All right, Tyler, great work. Thank you so much. She managed to quiet them all down. You see how Tyler does that? It's amazing. The glamour of the North Lawn, everybody. Inside that building right now is President Zelensky. Donald Trump is a pack of reporters in the Oval with them. As I mentioned, when that conversation ends, we'll actually be able to bring it to you here on Bloomberg as we add the voice of Gregory Cordy. Bloomberg politics, knee-deep in the Doge, and of course, no stranger to days like these at the White House. It's great to see. It's been too long. The body language in this East Room news conference is going to be interesting later on here. Are these two guys who like each other or not?
Volodymyr Zelensky is kind of a likable guy to a lot of Western leaders, but certainly has had his ups and downs with Trump. Trump is the kind of guy who, when he meets a world leader, can be cordial, he can be hospitable, and he's certainly hosting Zelensky at the White House today. But he has made some statements in recent weeks that have called into question the very foundations of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship over the past decade. Some very fundamental assumptions, including who started this war anyway.
Isn't that right?
That really has kind of, I'm sure, upset the apple cart. Zelensky's been working very hard over the past few weeks, and even during this transition, to make sure that there's some continuity of U.S. policy here, and it must feel like he's starting from ground zero.
I get that. And looking at the headlines here in the Oval, as I mentioned, I don't know how well this meeting is going. Maybe I'm just looking at the words. I can't hear the voices or see the posture. Donald Trump says he's for both Ukraine and Russia. He's in the middle of Russia, Ukraine. I'm for both is going to be the headline you're going to see on a lot of newspapers tomorrow morning, right? Says he has started the confines of a deal with Russia. Once a deal is done, it's over, he says. Russia will not want to return. Zelensky, on the other hand, they're signing this minerals deal. He says it's not enough. It's a good start, but not enough. Reiterating, Ukraine has a big need for air defense. Is he going to leave Washington disappointed?
I don't know. Just from the headlines that you're reading,
that's all we have to go on.
It sounds like a take it or leave it deal for Zelensky. That this is a deal that that the president of the United States is going to negotiate directly with the president of Russia, and that Ukraine, despite obviously having the most vested interest in the outcome of this deal, is going to be left on the sidelines. Zelensky's going to have to try to claw back to get a seat at the table.
I mentioned the fact that you're knee-deep in Doge. I don't know how you cover Doge. I try to just keep up with it while I'm on the air here. The headlines are just fast and furious, and frequently they contradict each other. You're also now a court reporter full-time because that's where a lot of these stories go. A federal judge ordered the administration to retract directives prompting the firing of thousands of federal workers. The emails they went out, they say, were illegal. The Trump administration says another email is going out on Saturday. Where does this whole thing stand right now?
Well, there's a lot of directives here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things going on all at once, and this is part of the. If we can just take a step back for a second, this is part of the grand strategy. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Coming out of the gate, we're only a month into this new Trump administration, and it's really a war they're fighting against their own federal bureaucracy on multiple fronts. There's the personnel front, trying to reduce the size of the federal workforce. There's regulations. There's getting rid of contractors, downsizing. We had a big story on the Bloomberg this morning about the downsizing of the real estate footprint and what that's doing to the commercial real estate market across the country.
Canceling a lot of leases.
All of this is happening, but the single thing that you alluded to that seems to be getting the most attention is this email that went out last Saturday from the Office of Personnel Management to 2.4 million civilian federal workers saying, please respond with 5 bullet points of what you did last week. And that is what every federal worker in this town is talking about. Conflicting advice from OPM, from the White House, from each of the cabinet secretaries of who has to respond, whether they even have to respond. And now we're told to expect a second email coming this weekend, and Musk says, this time I mean it, if you don't respond, you will be fired.
Judge says it's illegal. We're going to do it again?
We're going to do it all again. It really... the federal bureaucracy is no stranger to the micromanaging data call. That's what the federal government does best. And so there are some federal workers who are just sort of taking this all in stride. They've seen it before. There is an attitude that we've outlasted political, leadership from both parties over the years and the decades. But this feels different. This feels oppressive to a lot of federal workers.
Yeah.
It's almost intended to reduce morale.
To your point, this is the strategy, right? We'll have more on the purge after the weekend, and we'll see what happens with this email. Gregory Cordy, great to see you. We always miss you on Balance of Power when you're not with us. We'll turn back to this deal in Ukraine coming up next on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Final trading day of the month, and we have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing on this Friday. Stocks are rebounding in the final stretch of a rough February as economic numbers this morning reinforce bets that the Fed will cut rates at least twice this year. The S&P up 32 at 58.93. That is a gain of 0.5%. The Dow right now up 249, up 0.6%. NASDAQ up 117, also up by 0.6%. The 10-year currently at 4.23% with a 2-year yielding 4.00%. Spot gold down $30 the ounce, 28.47, down 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude 69.89 a barrel, down 0.6%, and Bitcoin just about flat on the day at 84,237. Some of the other stories that we're following: earnings news. Dell after earnings down 4.8%. Autodesk after earnings now down by 3.3%, and HP Inc. after earnings down 7.2%. Recapping stocks higher as we wrap up February. S&P up 0.5%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host. Here's Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We'll get back to Charlie Pellet and the latest on Wall Street on this PCE day a bit later this hour. We do have news from Washington. This is not going well. If you were with us at the top of the hour, you heard me make reference to headlines coming out of the Oval where President Zelensky is meeting right now with President Trump. This has now devolved into an argument. We're hearing from our reporters who are in the room, and we cannot give you a live view here until the conversation ends because of the nature of the way things go at the White House. Voices are now raised, and an argument has broken out in front of the press corps between President Trump, President Zelensky, and apparently Vice President J.D. Vance, with Donald Trump telling President Zelensky, "You don't have the cards right now." This is a direct quote. This is also coming through a translator that will be able to bring you in real time once this is playing back. But this does appear to be going off the rails a bit. Now, I'm going to remind you, not only do these two have a private meeting in the Oval, once reporters are excused from the room, they have a working lunch in the cabinet room, and then they're going to have a joint news conference, at least that's the plan, before scores of reporters, domestic and foreign correspondents, in the East Room, podia set up just like we saw with Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. Anything could change in this TikTok here. That's all we know. And Donald Trump is scheduled to get out of town around 5 o'clock to go down to Florida. So this is where we are. This could be a very important moment that we're witnessing right now in Washington. I just can't stress enough. What we're seeing, at least in text form out of the Oval Office right now, is painting a pretty ugly picture about where this is going. Remembering, they were supposed to be signing a minerals deal together that was going to then, of course, unlock talks for a peace deal. Stay with us here on Bloomberg. You will hear this conversation as soon as we can bring it to you from the Oval Office. And I want to bring in Dr. Rebecca Grant, which is always a good thing when we have a chance to talk to the doctor, Vice President of the Defense Programs at the Lexington Institute. Dr. Grant, I want to ask you about what's going on in there right now because we're not obviously there to have a sense of this conversation, the tone and the body language, but I do want to ask you a couple of things about what we're hearing and some of the requests that are coming from Ukraine. And number one, and we heard it from Keir Starmer yesterday, peacekeeping forces, a military backstop, if you will, security guarantees for peacekeeping forces from Europe. Donald Trump says, not going to happen. We'll have Americans working there on a minerals deal, and that will be the backstop. To the extent that you understand force protection and the risks that would come with a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine, does that sound like a workable plan?
Well, first of all, so many pieces of this plan have to come together, but let me point out something really important. Peacekeeping means a lot more than boots on the ground. Zelensky has never asked for American boots on the ground. I don't expect to see that. But modern day peacekeeping includes air surveillance. Let me tell you, there is a wall of NATO air power over there. It includes space surveillance. It includes cyber. There is a lot that can be done to watch Russia if we get a ceasefire. and to protect Americans that are there and work in a mineral deal, or European forces that are there in peacekeeping, and to protect Ukraine. So there are a lot of good options here for security. Yes, the U.S. is still going to be in a leadership role.
That's really helpful. If you can describe the situation on the ground now, we've been talking about this static line that's been drawn in the Donbass, World War I style atrophy, a war of attrition. They're bogged down in trenches. But I'm seeing reporting now that the F-16s that were considered to be ineffective, and you and I talked about the F-16s when that request first came and when they were first delivered, that Ukraine is using them in a more aggressive way, not just to knock down missiles and drones, but to actually attack Russian forces on the front lines. Is it making a difference?
Well, the F-16s are well suited for that air-to-ground attack. You know, the fact is we have a lot of different situations in Ukraine right now. There are trenches, as you mentioned. There are also Ukrainian forces inside Russia. And we are seeing a scramble on the ground between Russia that's trying to press to take some additional land and Ukraine that's trying to block that. Over top of all this, the heavy air defense protection over Ukraine. Russia flew 4 strategic bombers in that area and launched missiles earlier this week. So there is still a pretty intensive cat and mouse game going on in the air. But of course, what everybody wants to see is where do these lines fall in the end? And, you know, right now, Ukraine has to be very, very strong. If Ukraine looks weak, there's no negotiating with Putin. So Ukraine really has to keep up that fighting strength and fighting spirit as these talks begin.
Well, that's something. Does that require additional military support, whether that comes in the form of intelligence or actual hardware from the U.S. to continue that fight?
I think continuing military support and whatever intelligence assistance NATO has been providing all along. You know, the fact is that the war, it should have gone many different ways. We should have been stronger at the beginning. The way the battle looks now that Trump has inherited is not how anybody, including Zelensky, wants it to be. There aren't a lot of good options. You know, so Trump, big picture, is trying to see if Russia is willing to talk. The jury's still out on that. He does not have Putin on board. And then trying to strengthen the ties with Ukraine, now turning it towards an economic deal. And hey, I'm not surprised. Trump has said a lot. Zelensky has been a wartime leader for 3 years plus. And, you know, tensions are pretty high. I think Marco Rubio put it really well when he said a lot of things have been said, but we really got to see where the talks with Putin go.
Doctor, I'm looking at these headlines across the terminal. I can't believe what I'm reading coming out of the Oval here. Trump, Zelensky, Vance argue in the Oval Office. That's a headline. Trump to Zelensky, you either make a deal or we are out. If this mineral deal is not signed today, is the rest of the thing off?
No, and look, I'm not to minimize, but look at those 3 personalities, right? And Zelensky is very passionate. He has no choice but to appear to be a strong wartime leader. We know about Trump's frustrations. He hates this war. And we know J.D. Vance is a smart operator as well. So, you know what? I'm not actually so surprised that these 3 are going at it. And I would not for a second think that this means that the U.S. is not interested in European security. And I think that they will get this deal. I mean, there's been a lot of emotion and negotiation. We're seeing it in public. That's pretty unusual. But hey, this is Trump 2.0.
Yeah. It's almost like you've seen this movie before. What do you think of I'm for both? Donald Trump was asked, he says, I'm in the middle of Russia and Ukraine. I'm for both. He wants to be a mediator here, it seems, which is a striking difference than what we saw in the Biden administration when the president would not talk to Vladimir Putin, called him a dictator, and, of course, opened his arms to President Zelensky. What do you make of that change?
Well, we know Trump is serious about trying to bring this war to an end, but I'm telling you, if it gets too tough with Putin, he'll change position. I predicted these will be wild and woolly negotiations, and I do think long-term Trump wants to put a wedge between Russia and China, if at all possible. So this is very, very difficult. It sounds like a very difficult meeting going on, but I think Trump's plan to move this towards an economic link on this mineral deal is key, and I think we will see that deal get signed. Zelensky proposed it in the first place, don't forget.
Yeah, absolutely right. Rebecca Grant reminding us that she can dance on just about anything in the world of breaking news here. You know, we talked about the F-16s. We talked about the Abrams tanks at one point as well, that was a silly request and a foolish thing to provide because they couldn't maintain them. The training would take too long, and that's not exactly the kind of tool that they needed. Many said we should have been giving them more Patriots, more ATACMS, longer-range missiles earlier. Doctor, would that have made a difference?
Yes, I think it would have, because by the time Russia dug in late 2022, that made any counterattack much, much harder. There's no question that we made a mistake in trickling aid to Ukraine, and that's part of the frustration that you're seeing today. The systems we've given them have performed very well, Patriot, Abrams as well. It's a very difficult front, and what we've seen is some great use. Now, what we have to remember is our European allies are going to be afraid of Russia, rightly so, for a generation, and we need strong security from Helsinki to Istanbul and protections for Ukraine, because we must contain Russia.
How do you reconcile that with the conversation that the Doge is having, for instance, of slashing defense spending, about finding a more efficient way, about not building the old weapon systems, maybe turning away from aircraft carriers and F-35s? You've seen defense stocks go through extreme volatility in the throes of this conversation. But then we'll hear about, no, don't worry, it'll be the first $1 trillion defense budget of all time. What do you expect in terms of Pentagon spending? Because now we're talking about potentially, if you want to wonk out with me for a minute, Doctor, a continuing resolution for the rest of the year, which is going to raise a lot of eyebrows at the Pentagon.
CRs are bad, but remember, it's Congress that spends the money. Yes, we need aircraft carriers because they can penetrate into the combat zone and deliver a lot of combat power. My take on the Doge at the Pentagon is they want innovation. So yes, they're going to look at everything. They're going to try to get an audit, and they want to see those innovative programs, whether those are in space, whether that's new aircraft, drones, and try to prioritize those. And I think that's a good theme. It's going to turn out we need a lot of what we're already building, including F-35s, because we're in a hot world fight, you know, in a lot of zones, right? We've got a lot of forces still in the Middle East. But I think that what the Doge is trying to do is to prioritize innovation at the Pentagon, and you see that with the choices of Feinberg and Phelan and others to hold key roles there.
Well, we like the idea of innovation. Obviously, is there that much fraud, waste, and abuse at the Pentagon, though, to make a difference in the size of cuts that they're talking about?
You know, I think that's really hard to say. But remember, most administrations come in with a big agenda. What's unusual is seeing, you know, an 8% number on it. But when you really look at what is absolutely essential, I'd be surprised. I don't think that there's enough fraud, waste, and abuse. But we don't know. The Pentagon hasn't passed a clean audit. I'm sure they want to look around at that. But bottom line, we have heavy national security requirements. We're going to need to spend more on the U.S. Iron Dome or Eagle Dome, whatever we're going to call it. And so there are going to be some spending priorities. But right now, Doge is taking a pass at stressing innovation to see if they can wring some money out of that Pentagon budget.
Wow. Are you referring to, by the way, they're just getting ready to let us show you what took place in the Oval here as we wait to hear from Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Iron Dome for the U.S., is that what you're referring to? Donald Trump suggested he wanted that. And a lot of folks threw their hands up in the air. Well, how would you even make that happen? Where would we position all the missiles? How much would it cost?
Well, we're going to find out because he gave Secretary of Defense Hegseth a 60-day task, or they're about 30 days into that, to try to study what an Iron Dome style system would look like. It's going to be different since our threats come across the ocean. It won't be a short-range system, but there's plenty we can do to improve the defenses that we already have.
Is that Raytheon? Is it an old-style defense contractor or a company we've never heard of who would make that happen?
It's everybody. And hey, don't write off those folks who have invented how to do hit to kill in the exo-atmosphere. You saw what a great job a lot of those missiles did against Iran's attack on Israel. Some of the first combat uses of SM-31B and some others. That's exo-atmospheric. That's out in space. That's killing a missile in space. So I like that. But we're going to need everything, counter-drone, situation awareness to see where threats are coming from. It's going to take all of our best defense companies, big, small, and medium, in order to improve our missile and defenses against hypersonics here in the U.S.
I learned something every time I talk to Dr. Rebecca Grant. Just quickly, Doctor, before we hear from Trump, Zelensky, and the others here, if there's one thing we could give Ukraine to help on the ground in the fight, what would it be?
They'll say more ammunition at this point, especially as Russia continues to press. It would be great to have some authorization to attack some of those Russian strong points behind the lines. So as Britain has done, some authorization to use those slightly longer range precision artillery weapons would be very, very helpful right now. And long term, really F-35s.
F-35s, all right. That's a whole other show. You're going to have to come sit down with us in the studio one of these days. Dr. Rebecca Grant, it's great to see you. And thank you for sharing your experience with us. Vice President, Defense Programs at the Lexington Institute. We're going to have our panel standing by after we hear this conversation. If you're just joining us now, a conversation that devolved into a shouting match, an argument, we are told, between President Trump, President Zelensky, Vice President J.D. Vance. They are all in the Oval Office here. Let's bring it to you right now in full on Bloomberg.
The United States of America and for the good of the world. I'm aligned with the world, and I want to get this thing over with. You see the hatred he's got for Putin. It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate. He's got tremendous hatred, and I understand that, but I can tell you the other side isn't exactly in love with, you know, him either. So it's not a question of alignment. I'm aligned with the world. I want to get the thing set. I'm aligned with Europe. I want to see if we can get this thing done. You want me to be tough? I could be tougher than any human being you've ever seen. I'd be so tough. But you're never going to get a deal that way. So that's the way it goes. All right, one more question.
Hey, I want to respond to this. So look, for 4 years in the United States of America, we had a president who stood up at press conferences and talked tough about Vladimir Putin, and then Putin invaded Ukraine and destroyed a significant chunk of the country. The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy. We tried the pathway of Joe Biden of thumping our chest and pretending that the President of the United States' words mattered more than the President of the United States' actions. What makes America a good country is America engaging in diplomacy. That's what President Trump is doing.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now the President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact
2015.
2014 and 2014.
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
that's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, the situation the same. The people have been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him. A lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him, me, like a new president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire, all of them told me that he will never go. We signed him with gas contract, yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Count one.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, Everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position to
this question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this.
what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very
you will
good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a minute.
answer?
No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning.
I know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this cabinet.
We gave you, through
I
this
said
stupid president, $350 billion. We gave
for
you
your
military equipment, and your men are brave, but they had to use our military.
What about
if you didn't have our military equipment,
you invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak.
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I
Again,
tell you.
just say thank you.
I said a lot of times
accept that
thank
there,
you
accept
to
that,
American people.
accept that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on.
I understand,
over
sir.
there. I think it's very important. That's why I kept this going so long. You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards.
Thankful.
You're buried there. Your people are dying.
I can tell you
You're
again,
running low
I know.
on soldiers.
Don't, please,
you're running
Mr.
low on
President.
soldiers. It would be a damn good thing.
Mr.
And then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire. I want to go, and I wanted this. Look, if you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed.
Of course, we want to stop the war.
But you're saying you don't want a ceasefire.
But I said to you,
I want a ceasefire.
with guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
That wasn't with me.
For you what,
that
what
wasn't
this
with me.
means.
That was with a guy named Biden, who was not a smart person. That was with Obama.
President. It was your president.
Excuse me. That was with Obama, who gave you sheets, and I gave you javelins.
Yes.
I gave you the javelins to take out all those tanks. Obama gave you sheets. In fact, the statement is Obama gave sheets and Trump gave javelins. You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards. But without us, you don't have any cards.
One more question to Mr. Vice President. I'm sorry. Here.
It's going to be a tough deal to make, because the attitudes have to change.
What if Russia breaks ceasefire? What if Russia breaks peace talks? What do we do then? I understand that it's a heated conversation right now.
What are you saying?
She's asking, what if Russia breaks the ceasefire?
What if anything? What if a bomb drops on your head right now? Okay? What if they broke it? I don't know. They broke it with Biden, because Biden, they didn't respect him. They didn't respect Obama. They respect me. Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia. You ever hear of that deal? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam. Hillary Clinton, Shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through it. We didn't end up in a war. And he went through it. He was accused of all that stuff. He had nothing to do with it. It came out of Hunter Biden's bathroom. It came out of Hunter Biden's bedroom. It was disgusting. And then they said, oh, the laptop from hell was made by Russia. The 51 agents. The whole thing was a scam. And he had to put up with that. He was being accused of all that stuff. All I can say is this. He might have broken deals with Obama and Bush, and he might have broken them with Biden. He did, maybe. Maybe he didn't. I don't know what happened. But he didn't break them with me. He wants to make a deal. I don't know if you can make a deal. The problem is I've empowered you to be a tough guy. And I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing. All right, I think we've seen enough. What do you think? Huh? This is going to be great television, I will say that. All right. We'll see what we can do about putting it together. We'll see. I don't know.
All right, guys, come on. Please.
All right, there you have President Trump, President Zelensky, Vice President J.D. Vance, and others in a very crowded Oval Office in what was a bilateral meeting that turned into an argument. Just bringing that to you as it's coming into our newsroom right now. They jumped in about halfway through the meeting, so we might be able to get you some other comments from the beginning of that conversation as reporters are escorted outside of the Oval Office. Donald Trump to Volodymyr Zelensky, you either make a deal or we are out, he said. Telling Zelensky he has to be thankful, and he said it's going to be very hard to do business like this. As President Zelensky tried to make his case to J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and others, things got very chippy in the middle of that meeting, and we want to assemble our political panel. They were listening along with us here. Our signature panel together, Rick Davis, Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, of course, our Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. Rick, I'm not sure I've ever heard anything like that come out of a meeting of world leaders in the Oval Office. Typically, an argument like that would be behind closed doors. It just played out for everyone to see. Is this relationship broken? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, Joe, I'm not sure you would even say that this kind of argument ever happens behind closed doors. I mean, these kinds of state-to-state discussions are usually finely tuned. They're prepped. They have lots of staff involved, making sure that the time that the two principals spend together is well orchestrated and that the outcome is totally predetermined. The idea that you would put these two folks in the Oval Office with a bunch of reporters to hash it out is something I don't think I've ever seen in 5 decades of Washington statecraft. So I think what we just witnessed was something that, look, I mean, everybody knew Donald Trump kind of, goes his own way. But the idea that this is either good for America, good for Ukraine, or good for the world is nuts. This was an incredible failure of diplomacy. And regardless of what happens today, maybe they get a deal and they sign it. Showing this makes both countries look weak.
Wow. Jeannie, give me your take on this. Was it a conversation? A lot of people stressed out, went off the rails when they heard the wrong words from Volodymyr Zelensky. He wasn't thankful enough, or was this a setup? Did Donald Trump and J.D. Vance plan to do this with the cameras in the room?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big questions hanging over this meeting, in addition to security guarantees, which we could probably forget that question for right now, was, can we work together? Vladimir Zelensky trying to test out, does Donald Trump, like me enough that we can make this happen? And that kind of exchange is just a reminder. And interpersonal relationships matter an awful lot in these things. So that seems to be very clear. There is not a lot of love lost there. And of course, this is quite embarrassing from the perspective of the United States. He is talking to our ally in this war. He is talking to a country invaded by Putin in 2014. 7 million Ukrainians have fled their homeland. We are talking of hundreds of thousands of innocent people now dead, 4 million still displaced. And he is being told from the vice president and the president of the United States, heretofore their allies, that you are not being thankful enough to us as you sit here. And so it is quite an embarrassing spectacle. It does look made for TV from my perspective. You wouldn't believe it unless you saw it firsthand that this was the conversation that they're having. And I can't imagine what it looks like behind the scenes. This is what they're displaying publicly.
Oh my God, yeah. Well, what do you think, Rick? Did this feel spontaneous? And does this torpedo the bilateral news conference they had planned for 10 minutes from now?
You know, it's hard to tell what they're going to do to put this back together, you know, behind closed doors now. It's going to have to take a lot of work because I think both principals are, you know, going back to their neutral corners, ready to come out throwing punches again. Look, I mean, Donald Trump, I think, started out this session pretty constructively. And I must admit, I mean, the interjections by Vice President Vance really stoked a lot of anger in the room and was really counterproductive, I thought. And even Donald Trump at the end tried to bring it back and saying, look, we just want to stop the killing and get a deal. And the elements of a deal are there, right? I mean, he's had great meetings this week with, you know, leaders of Europe and in France and Great Britain, all of whom have guaranteed certain security measures that they would do in case of a ceasefire or a end of the war. And I mean, like, he was walking in, the president of the United States, into kind of a very positive environment where he could, you know, didn't have to commit to putting troops on the ground, but, you know, could obviously continue to say, we're going to supply you with materials and weapons because you're going to pay for them. And that kind of relationship is traditional for us. I mean, and it's sustainable over time. It's a real mature relationship between U.S. and one of its allies and supporters, Ukraine. So everyone thought this was going to be sort of the beginning of a real mature relationship, one that's post combat conflict. And my impression was that's not something J.D. Vance wanted to see happen today, and set out to try and derail it right there in front of the American public.
Just about a minute or two left here, Jeannie. Donald Trump invoked Vladimir Putin, talked about what they had gone through, how much they went through together during the Russia investigation. He started doing the Russia thing. He got very angry looking as he was referring to this. He also revealed that he just met again recently with Vladimir Putin. Do you think the Russian president had a sense of what this meeting was going to be like?
You know, it's hard to know. We thought this was a win for Vladimir Zelensky, that he got to Donald Trump personally face-to-face first. And, you know, I think there is going to be some criticism all around, obviously starting with J.D. Vance, but including Vladimir Zelensky. The reality is Ukraine, unfortunately, does not have a lot of cards to play. And those were the exact words that Donald Trump used. I'm not sure he needed to say it that viscerally, but that's what he said, and he's right. That's why Zelensky's task today was to do what they told Queen Victoria: close your eyes and think of England, close your eyes and think of Ukraine. And the reality is he couldn't get there in the face of J.D. Vance's taunting. And so I think he's going to bear some criticism on this as well, because the reality is Ukraine needs the support of the United States if they are going to sustain.
Well, our panel's going to stay with us. G.D. Shanzano and Rick Davis back in hour 2. We're going to try to unpack what the heck just happened in the Oval Office. So stay with us right here on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The meeting devolves into an argument. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky meet at the White House to talk about ending the war in Ukraine, intentions to sign a minerals deal. But talks fell apart in front of the cameras and microphones a short time ago. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, we've never seen anything like that in the Oval Office, and it's unclear what the heck happens now. These two are supposed to have a bilateral news conference starting in just a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I guess we'll see if that goes forward, if this deal they were intending to sign today is able to go forward at all after a meeting, which frankly lacks the dignity you would usually see when heads of state are meeting at the Oval Office at the White House. Yeah. What started pretty cordially as President Trump was heralding this deal he said would benefit both the U.S. and Ukraine started to sour, and it does seem it may have happened after President Zelensky suggested that he still needs security guarantees, that this deal alone, this document, is not going to be enough. That is when Vice President J.D. Vance also got involved. Things got heated and frankly loud in the aftermath, with President Trump suggesting that Zelensky does not hold the cards, and to quote him, "You're gambling with World War III."
Yeah, voices were raised. People were very upset. You either make a deal or we are out, Donald Trump said to President Zelensky. Telling him he has to be thankful, and said it's going to be very hard to do business like this. To your point, it's unclear if we get a minerals deal, if we advance to peace talks right now with Vladimir Putin, who Donald Trump says he just recently spoke to. This is quite a moment. If they do get into the East Room as planned for their joint news conference, we'll bring it to you live here on Bloomberg.
Yeah, I guess it's still a question of if that happens at this point. Things are behind closed doors now, so we have less visibility, but we should learn more in short order. We'll have much more on this live with a report from the White House from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in just a moment, but we also want to check on the markets, and Charlie Pellet has a look from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kayla Lyons. Indeed, all of this playing out on Wall Street. Stocks move from gains to losses as Trump-Zelensky plays out on the stock market. We've got the S&P right now down 7, 58.53 where we stand. That is a drop of 0.1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average now lower by 16, little change, down less than 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 41, drop there of 0.2%. Nasdaq 100 Index also lower now by 0.2%. Small cap shares, the Russell 2000 Index down by 0.1%. But to be clear, the Dow, the S&P, Nasdaq all had been higher earlier in the session, but all now in the red. We've got the 10-year 4.23%, the 2-year 3.99% now on the 2-year. Spot gold down $32 the ounce, down 1.1%, 28.45, and West Texas Intermediate crude 69.89 a barrel, down 0.6%. Wells Fargo has abandoned its net zero commitment, discontinuing its sector-specific 2030 interim financed emissions targets and its goal to achieve net zero by 2050 for financed emissions. Meanwhile, BlackRock is scrapping its aspirational workforce representation objectives, reversing course on earlier goals after President Trump moved to end diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practices. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the markets from New York. Thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, we've all just been rocked by the tape we saw from the Oval Office, a meeting that is taking place and still is behind closed doors between President Trump, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and others as well, including Vice President J.D. Vance, who was also involved when the conversation took a turn. What was originally supposed to be a visit in which a minerals deal would be signed, maybe other negotiations around ending the war with Russia would be had, has devolved into something where we are now questioning how things move forward. As President Trump suggested, it's going to be difficult to do business with President Zelensky.
Yeah, this is really something. This was a roughly 45-minute long conversation. About halfway through it, once Vice President J.D. Vance started to challenge President Zelensky and ask him why he hadn't been more thankful, voices were raised, and a lot of things were said here, Kaylee, that maybe some of them wish hadn't been said. There's another side of that coin, and you wonder if some of this might have been planned. You wonder how much was spontaneous, knowing that there are, of course, a number of Donald Trump supporters who were hoping to see a conversation like this, who don't like the way that Volodymyr Zelensky has presented himself. Let's bring you in the room for a
You're
moment.
right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a
from
very
the
bad position, and he happens to be right about
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not
Mr.
in a good
Brown,
position.
I
You don't
was
have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing
cards.
cards.
Right now, you
I'm
don't.
very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people. You're gambling with World War
what
III.
you're
You're
thinking
gambling
about?
with
What are you
World
thinking
War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's
with
backed
all respect to
you
your
far
country.
more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire
today.
meeting, have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
We're going to have a conversation ahead with former Ambassador Daniel Fried. First, we want to talk with Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage here in Washington, D.C. Nick, have you ever seen anything like this before?
No, I have not. That was one of the most extraordinary bits of television I've ever seen. Obviously, the president there getting extremely angry, and then Vice President J.D. Vance essentially asking Zelensky to grovel and to express thanks to the U.S., which, of course, he has done many times before for the weaponry and the aid that the U.S. has provided. So an extraordinary moment.
Well, certainly so. And I guess the question, Nick, is now what moments come after this? Things have moved behind closed doors, but initially there was supposed to be an agreement signed in front of the press in the East Room of the White House. That was supposed to be scheduled to happen at this hour. Is there any indication of whether that will still happen?
Well, we are trying to figure that out. I mean, the big question here is, does that go ahead, or are we at an impasse where essentially the relationship is totally broken? I mean, it had been clear for some time that President Trump was not excited about Volodymyr Zelensky. He did at one point call him a dictator, though then in the last day or two we'd had a turn where it felt like the situation was warming up a little bit. Things were getting better. They thought they had a deal that served Ukraine's interests, essentially punted a lot of questions until later, but gave President Trump a document to show his supporters to say, look, we are going to get something out of this. Now seems very unlikely to me that the two sides, without some further intervention, would be willing to sit down and actually put pen to paper, put their signatures on that document, and then the whole thing may end up in total collapse, but we'll just have to see in the next hour or so. They're also supposed to have a press conference, and of course, it's not going to happen. So,
great question. We will bring it to our viewers and listeners if it does. Nick, that was scheduled to begin 7 minutes ago, but obviously things were running late before things started getting angry. Donald Trump said to Volodymyr Zelensky, you either make a deal or we are out. You take him at his word?
Yes, I would take him at his word on that. I mean, you know, the thing that's so interesting is this critical minerals deal, when you get down to it, was essentially an agreement to have talks about talks at a later time. So there wasn't really anything in it that actually committed either side to much of anything. And indeed, there was some speculation that this was basically something that Ukraine and some pro-Ukraine lawmakers and others in the United States could put in front of President Trump and say, listen, we got this from them. Now we can get down to the real business of actually having real negotiations, both over this deal, but over a peace agreement later on. So if President Trump essentially backs out and throws himself in with the Russian side, or abandons Ukraine and lets Russia run roughshod over Ukrainian territory, I mean, this is a critical moment. This is just completely unprecedented. So again, we should have more clarity in the next couple of hours and also in the coming days. But what you really saw here was just the eruption of the hostility we had known that President Trump felt about Ukraine from some time, but had been restrained from exhibiting. Now it feels like those shackles are basically off.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much with reaction to the footage we've all just seen. And watching it alongside us now here in our Washington, D.C. studio is Ambassador Daniel Fried, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, also former U.S. Ambassador to Poland and former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. So obviously we all saw, we all heard the exchange that happened between these three Ambassador, what do you make of it?
Take a step back. The U.S. has an interest in Ukraine succeeding. Our problems in the world get better if Ukraine survives and prospers. And if Russia wins, our problems get worse. It's been quite a week. The Trump plan for Ukraine, as we understand it, could work and was getting some traction. Ceasefire in place, British and French-led force in Ukraine, maybe with American backup, a minerals deal with Ukraine that gives President Trump the ability to say, yeah, I've got a stake in this. That could come together. And now this blow up. Let's hope, best case, that they pull it together. President Trump loves drama for TV. Let's hope that they can pull it together, sign the minerals deal, move forward, because the U.S., the Trump administration could succeed. And Trump could get what he wants, which is to push back on Putin, be seen as doing so, and be seen as a peacemaker. Now, I realize that this may be completely fanciful if in the next few hours this all blows up. I get that. But my job for 40 years, Foreign Service Officer, is to try to look at the way forward. And there is a way forward, which is why my frustration is that the administration keeps stepping on its own policy. This fight in the Oval was not necessary, especially because Zelensky is actually working according to Trump's plan. He's ready to sign the deal. I suspect he's ready to accept a ceasefire if he gets enough security. Trump could win if he has the discipline to see it through.
You've been in many rooms with world leaders for very sensitive negotiations. I'm guessing you two have never seen anything quite like that. Did it feel authentic? Did it feel spontaneous? Or was there some show business with cameras and microphones in the room today?
That's a good question. I watched it carefully. I think Vice President Vance was provoking Zelensky. I think Zelensky could have answered it differently. He was trying to explain the details. That's not what I would have done or advised him to do. But then you had the president and the vice president basically bullying a Democratic leader who is fighting for his freedom and ours. So I don't see what American interest is advanced by having this fight. Was it deliberate? Was it an ambush? It's possible, but the larger question remains, what do we get out of having a fight? I know what Putin gets. What do we get? We get a lot if Ukraine succeeds, and especially if we get the British and French to carry the heavy load of the security burden. That's quite a success for Trump, success for America. I'm all on board. But the administration has to follow its own plan and not get distracted by this stuff.
Well, on your point, Ambassador, about it being in U.S. interest to see Ukraine succeed to the extent it can, it did seem we saw President Zelensky trying to make that point when he suggested, yes, I know you're here on the other side of the Atlantic, but you could ultimately feel this. President Trump pushed back on that, saying, don't tell us what to feel, but also then later suggested Zelensky right now is toying with World War III, which presumably would involve the U.S. in somehow. We aren't immune to conflicts like that, as we saw with the prior World War. So which is it?
Yeah, President Trump was just wrong about that. We thought we were safe behind two oceans and then Pearl Harbor, right? We figured it out fast. We can't be the lonely bastion of freedom in the world. That's what Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Ronald Reagan taught us. And that's the right lesson. And it is the Trump administration, in its more wise moments, understood that we're in a period of great power rivalry and we have adversaries. Russia, China, Iran. So, yeah, let's work with our friends to contend with our adversaries. And Ukraine is our friend. Maybe a little difficult sometime, but still.
But the president today didn't seem to characterize Russia as an adversary necessarily. When he was asked, do you feel in the middle? He said, I'm for both, Ukraine and Russia. How did you interpret that?
Well, that's not the language I would have used. And I don't think our position at the UN was very good on Monday, where we supported a weak resolution. But if that's the way President Trump wants to play it, okay, play it that way, but then land the deal. And the deal has to provide for Ukraine's security, because if it doesn't, then we've been suckered by the Russians. And in, diplomacy, don't be the sucker.
We love talking with practitioners. You're a career diplomat. Bring us into the room. And maybe not an extreme like this, but when a meeting devolves, the reporters have left. Who is in the diplomatic delegation who gets their arms around this? Do people go to separate rooms? What do you do now as a diplomat when the meeting just blew up in your face?
You advise your principal on how to fix it. What do you do to set it right? What do you do in terms of what's possible for you politically? And someone like me is supposed to find a way forward. So, if I were advising President Trump, I would say, look, you made your point. Now tell Zelensky, make light of it. Tell Zelensky we need a deal. Let's show people after we've pushed back that we can do this.
But you get the boss alone in a room right now. Everyone goes cool off for a minute. I need to talk to you alone.
The national security, this is the job for the national security advisor.
Yep.
And I think Mike Waltz is a serious person.
And he was right in there.
That's right. Yeah. Now, I also think that Zelensky's people should figure out a way for him to approach Trump and make clear that, yeah, he's grateful to the United States. And yeah, he appreciates Trump's role in pushing things forward. Say that. It's true enough, and it will help. So at moments like this, the pros scramble. Don't wring your hands. Don't complain. Figure out what you're going to do. Figure out the way forward. And do it fast.
Maybe they will have this news conference, Kayleigh.
Well, I was just about to ask, Ambassador, do you have confidence that they are able to do that? And we'll see these two having corrected or taken the break that they need, facing the press once again this afternoon.
I'm in an impossible position because we're going to know just how wrong I am. I would say this, because it's Donald Trump, who loves drama and twists and turns, he could easily decide to pull it back. He could. Now, I'm not saying he will, but I don't think all is necessarily lost, right? He loves TV drama, and he's got one going. But the drama, you don't milk that drama if you continue the fight. You get more attention and put yourself maybe in a stronger tactical position if you can come out and say, yeah, that was rough, but we've agreed. So if I were advising the president, I would say, okay, you pushed hard, now land a deal.
If you're Donald Trump, you can take credit for saving this day, can't you, if things go right?
That would be my advice. Again, they're not going to ask me, but somebody like me is supposed to advise the president on how to succeed on his terms.
Ambassador, I apologize for interrupting, but we just got a statement from the president, which reads as follows. It's amazing what comes out through emotion, and I have determined that President Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved because he feels our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage, I want peace. He goes on to say, he disrespected the United States of America in its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he is ready for peace.
Well, pretty remarkable here.
Well, that's unfortunate, especially because we showed no similar toughness in New York on Monday with a weak UN resolution. Not good, and I don't see what American interest is advanced thereby.
If there was one voice we could have at the table today, it would be Daniel Fried. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us at this critical moment in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons. We'll have much more ahead with our signature panel. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A rebound in U.S. stocks has sputtered as a tough and frank discussion between the U.S. and Ukraine at the White House raised concerns about geopolitical risks. We've got stocks close to session lows right now, with the S&P down 22. That is a drop of 0.4%. The Dow down 126, lower by 0.3%. And NASDAQ right now down 103 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop of 0.6%. The 10-year at 4.22%. The 2-year 3.99%. Gold down $32 the ounce, down 1.1%, $28.44. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5% below $70 a barrel this Friday, $69.96 on WTI. Bitcoin right now down 1.2%. Bitcoin just above $83,200. So again, recapping, stocks lower, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. After earnings, Dell shares down 7.1%. After earnings, Autodesk shares down 5%. And HPQ, Hewlett-Packard Inc., it reported last night as well, down 9.2%. Balance of power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Here in Washington, we are dealing with some breaking news, as it seems the rest of what we were expecting to take place at the White House today is off. Bloomberg just confirming that the joint press conference that was scheduled to be this afternoon between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is canceled after an argument in the Oval Office. Today was originally supposed to be about signing a minerals deal, and no sign that is actually going to take place, as President Trump has taken to Truth Social, saying he is determined that Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved. He went on to say he disrespected the United States of America and its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he's ready for peace.
Yeah, so we've got a problem. This was a meeting that devolved into a bit of a shouting match. Voices were raised, an argument took place, and we brought you into the Oval Office for this conversation. It was really once Vice President J.D. Vance started to address and challenge Volodymyr Zelensky about not being thankful enough that things started to get chippy. By the time Donald Trump was speaking, he was genuinely angry and threatening to pull out of all of these talks now. You mentioned his post on Truth Social. Yeah. It's possible that Zelensky will talk to reporters in the driveway, because we're not getting a East Room news conference now. If that happens, we'll bring you into the driveway to hear more from him. His vehicle is still parked in front of the entrance to the West Wing. And we've got our panel with us, Kaylee. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano have been listening and watching along with us. We want to bring you into the Oval before we get their take on what just happened for an unprecedented moment in politics. Let's watch and listen.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now the President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact
2015.
2014.
2014 and
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
that's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, the situation the same. The people have been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him, a lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him, me, like a new president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed him with gas contract. Gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broke this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Count once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's back to you, far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you can...
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't been
in this
alone.
cabinet.
You haven't been alone.
In this cabinet.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military equipment, and your men are brave, but they had to use our military.
What about
if you didn't have our military equipment,
if you
didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days. I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something
maybe
new.
Less.
In 2 weeks. Of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I tell you.
Just say thank you.
I said a lot of
accept that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on.
I understand, sir.
I think it's very important. That's why I kept this going so long. You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards.
Thankful.
You're buried there. Your people are dying. You're running low on soldiers. Listen, you're running low on soldiers. It would be a damn good thing. And then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire. I want to go and I wanted this. Look. If you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed.
Of course, we want to stop the war.
But you're saying you don't want a ceasefire.
But I said to you,
I want a ceasefire.
With guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
That wasn't with me. That wasn't with me. That was with a guy named Biden, who was not a smart person. That was with Obama.
It was your president.
Excuse me. That was with Obama, who gave you sheets, and I gave you javelins.
Yes.
I gave you the javelins to take out all those tanks. Obama gave you sheets. In fact, the statement is Obama gave sheets and Trump gave javelins. You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards. But without us, you don't have any cards.
And there you have it, the dispute in the Oval Office between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which has now resulted in the cancellation of a press conference that was supposed to be held at this hour with Trump and Zelensky. And Donald Trump saying on Truth Social that Zelensky can return when he is ready for peace. We are watching outside the White House to see if the Ukrainian president does indeed depart and whether or not he speaks to press in the aftermath of this, given that the scheduled time at which he could have done so has now been called off.
Yeah, we should note, by the way, that this is an incredibly busy day at the White House. There are scores of reporters there who also came from Europe, came from Ukraine, not to mention, of course, the American reporters who were there for a very important day that we expected to see the signing of a minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. The briefing room is packed. The Oval Office was packed with those selected to be part of the pool today, but there will be a throng of reporters. I believe Josh Wingrove described it as a zoo when he got there earlier this morning. They're in the driveway, as you can see now on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. The vehicle that brought Volodymyr Zelensky to the White House is waiting for him just outside the West Wing entrance. And if we were able to pull out a bit, you'd see the sticks, as they call it, the stakeout position where microphones and cameras are waiting for him. So, Kaylee, he may well take some questions. We'll find out together.
Indeed. And while we await to find out, we turn back to our signature political panel who is with us today, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, given what we all just listened to, again, the tone, the language that these three were using with each other in the Oval Office of all places, are you surprised that things cannot move forward in the aftermath, or at least don't seem to be moving forward now?
Yeah, you would think that they'd set aside the emotion that the statement referred to from the White House and regroup with their teams. I can imagine National Security Advisor Walls is in conversations with the president, vice president, and his team, trying to make something out of this. You don't get these opportunities very often to have something go forward toward a constructive peace agreement like today was planned to be, and allow something like this spectacle in the Oval Office to derail it. But the statement it speaks for itself. It sounds like there's no further progress that'll be had today, and these teams will have to reset and find a new avenue toward diplomacy. So this is not followed along the lines of any diplomatic effort I've ever seen. Lots of momentum coming into today with the meetings earlier this week with the Prime Minister of the UK and the President of France. And you would have thought that this would have resulted in a very positive, constructive outcome. Instead, you have high fives in the Kremlin. This is exactly what they would have wanted to see happen. And it's going to be a big step backwards in stopping the fight that Donald Trump claims is his #1 priority: stop the bloodshed.
High fives in the Kremlin, Jeannie. Would it be smart politically for Zelensky to come out of that West Wing entrance we're looking at right now and take questions from reporters, try to make this case, or does he dig the hole deeper for Ukraine?
You know, it is such a tough call for Zelensky. He had one big job to do, which was to try to mend a heretofore difficult relationship with Donald Trump today. And the clip you played is so important because you can hear him at the offset of that trying, fairly innocently to explain to J.D. Vance and the president the history. He is a war leader for 3 years. The history of his country going back to 2014, the 2 Minsk agreements signed that Vladimir Putin, after invading his country, did not live up to, and trying to explain to them why they cannot trust, or he cannot trust, Putin to live up to an agreement now. And then you hear J.D. Vance come in quite frankly, like he was talking to one of his young children or something, berating Zelensky. And then, of course, Donald Trump jumped right into that. And, the reality is that this is going to be very, very tough to repair. It doesn't mean we won't get that rare earth mineral deal, but this goes so far beyond that. And I think one thing to watch for here is, can Marco Rubio and Waltz, who are more interventionist in the traditional sense, walk Donald Trump off the ledge here and walk this back and get this deal back on track? I don't know if it's possible, but there is a big division in this administration between those who are non-interventionists like J.D. Vance, who, by the way, in the Senate did not support aid for Ukraine, and those like Rubio and Waltz. And we have to see if they can bring Donald Trump back to the idea that a deal on the rare mineral or rare earth minerals would give us a leg up economically. And then that would sort of, lay the groundwork for them to move forward with a potentially relationship to be built on with Zelensky. But very, very tough for Zelensky. 3 years at war, so many people dead and displaced, to have to listen to the vice president demanding that he be express more gratitude, and quite frankly, the ahistorical, renditions of what has happened in his own country.
Well, to Jeannie's point, Rick, as we consider the cast of characters here beyond just the president and vice president, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, those who are more hawkish in Congress who have long supported Ukraine. I'm thinking here Senators Lindsey Graham and others. Do you expect a collective voice here could come to check the impulses of the president and vice president on this one, or is it ultimately what they say that will go? Because President Trump is suggesting he's communicating directly with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Kaylee, what the net effect's going to be with the president's leaders in Republican Party who are, as you described them, more hawkish toward the Kremlin. So we've not seen much evidence of that, although many of them did come out and vocally reinforce the fact that when the president called Zelensky a dictator, they pushed back on that and made it clear that Vladimir Putin's the dictator. That being said, Congress has not played even a marginal role in the peace process, if you want to call it that, after today. And so I can't imagine anybody's going to want to stick their neck out too soon after this debacle to see where it goes from here. So I think everyone's going to wind up taking a big step back and assess the damage in our relationships that this will result from. The relationship with our ally, the Ukraines, NATO members, and what their reaction to this is going to be. Other members of our global partners and allies that we have who see this Ukraine war as a microcosm of conflicts around the world that could be to come. And this is obviously going to fan a lot of insecurity in every corner of the world after today.
Pretty remarkable optics, Jeannie. I think we can agree. And there were things not captured on the cameras that were pointed at Trump, Zelensky, J.D. Vance, and others. Ukrainian Ambassador Oksana Markarova, who has joined us on this program, put her head in her hands as the shouting match took place in the Oval Office. Jeannie, it says a lot when we consider that particular moment, and I wonder what it means for Ukraine and how much may have been lost today.
Yeah, Joe, I'm so glad you mentioned that photo. I saw that photo as well, and I think it is just so worth reflecting on how much it encapsulates really the shock and horror for Ukrainians who have seen in just a matter of a few weeks their closest ally, the United States, essentially switch sides. You now have an administration echoing Vladimir Putin talking points. And, Rick was talking about the Kremlin cheering. People are talking about them popping champagne. This is the best case scenario for Putin. And this is, again, a war-torn country. It has been for over a decade. Russia occupies 20% of Ukraine. And what Zelensky was trying to school, and maybe it wasn't the time to do this, President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance on, is the reality of that, how much has been lost. And, he was interrupted by demands for, pledging fealty to the president. So, yeah, that picture is absolutely stunning and speaks volumes about what Ukrainians and, quite frankly, Europeans and allies of the United States around the world must be feeling today, watching this implosion in the Oval Office.
Well, meanwhile, we're watching what's happening outside the West Wing as photographers are now emerging from the doors And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is now, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube for the benefit of our radio audience, getting into his vehicle. So he is leaving the White House after, again, President Trump told him he can come back when he is ready for peace. He has now gotten into the vehicle. I would imagine, Joe, in short order, we're going to see it leave the White House complex and go elsewhere from there, knowing this is not how Zelensky originally intended for the afternoon to go. The intention initially, at least it was understood, was to be signing a deal on minerals today, but obviously that is not how things have gone down, as Zelensky is now in the car and others from the delegation appear to be leaving the White House.
Streaming out of the West Wing right now. Reporters standing by in the driveway, not likely to be very nourished with what we're getting here. Our reporter Tyler Kendall on the ground at the White House says they are preparing to open the Northwest Gate to let him out of the campus, having stayed the night at the Hay Adams Hotel. Kaylee, he was not at Blair House, as we saw the other leaders inside the White House complex. It's pretty clear he's not going to be taking questions here. In fact, he came out of that door rather quickly. The rest of the delegation is being put into a van. Once they get out of there here, we'll see what's left, Kaylee, and whether we get a statement from Donald Trump. One thing I will make clear to our viewers and listeners is we have an important interview that's coming up. Bloomberg's David Weston is supposed to be talking with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about an hour and 15 minutes from now. I suspect the trajectory of that conversation will be a bit different than it would have been a few hours ago.
Yeah, knowing Bessent was the one initially dispatched to Ukraine to present the first iteration of this minerals agreement. It ended up looking very different in terms of what was going to be signed today as the U.S. pulled back demands on the numbers, reaching $500 billion and some other things. But Bessent was deeply involved in this work. So we'll, of course, hear from him, the Treasury Secretary, as we now see the van carrying the Ukrainian delegation and the vehicle with President Zelensky in it leaving the White House complex. And it is worth noting as well, Volodymyr Zelensky was scheduled to have an interview on Fox this evening. He did not speak to press as he was leaving the White House just now, but we could still hear from him later on today as he characterizes his own version of the day's events. Again, events that to this point look like they have not benefited the prospects of a deal being reached between the U.S. and Ukraine, and untold what that will mean for the ultimate deal the Trump administration is trying to negotiate to end the war with Russia.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, we were supposed to be bringing you a joint news conference between Trump and Zelensky at this time. It has been canceled after a meeting in the Oval Office turned sour. Voices were raised, an argument was had, and frankly, it's unclear exactly where this relationship is going and what the status of talks are with Ukraine and with Russia. We are spending time with our signature panel right now, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, as we try to get our heads around everything that just happened here. Rick, what takes place now that President Zelensky has left the White House? The diplomatic corps, national security advisor have to hash out what might be the next step here. What do you expect?
Yeah, I'm sure the team is meeting right now in the Oval Office with the President of the United States, the National Security Advisor, and other leadership within the White House, those who attended the meeting and those who have responsibilities for the various branches of service that will be involved normally in an event like this with a country as close as we are to Ukraine. And the real question is, where do you go from here? How do you look at a trajectory that Donald Trump clearly had a plan, right? He's been talking directly to Vladimir Putin, creating an opening, massaging egos in the Kremlin to get them to a place where he thinks he could get a deal, probably managing some of his public statements about Ukraine with that in mind, which has strained the relationship with Ukraine, but otherwise has resulted in what we thought was going to be the first step, a agreement to give U.S. access to rare earths in order to, in essence, pay back some of the money that we've invested in the Ukraine effort. That's now shot. The real question is, too, to me, that Vladimir Zelensky and his team will meet back probably at the hotel right across the Lafayette Plaza from the White House. You can see one from the other. And they're going to have to assess, do they stay in Washington? Do they get on a plane and leave? Do they continue to hold interviews and press availabilities that are currently scheduled, or do they take those off the schedule? Look, this was not a good day for either individual. Vladimir Zelensky came to an Oval Office visit knowing Donald Trump well and knowing that he has an explosive and erratic personality sometimes. And I don't put any of this on Zelensky, but his reactions didn't result in a meeting that was constructive either. And so both teams are assessing that to this minute to determine where they go from here.
I think we had all drawn this conclusion already, but Bloomberg is now confirming with sources familiar that the U.S. and Ukraine did not sign that minerals deal today. They failed to sign the agreement on natural resources. Jeannie, it's also worth pointing out, as we have just seen now, a third world leader leaving the White House this week. This follows a meeting which, by all accounts, seemed to be successful between President Trump and the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer yesterday, a similar one with the French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday. Where is Europe in all of this, having just had those meetings, having those two countries having pledged support for peacekeeping troops if a deal is ultimately agreed to? How are our allies likely viewing what went down today?
Well, they have to just be as stunned as we all are. I mean, this was supposed to be, to your point, Kaylee, the bookend of this week of meetings that started off with Macron and Starmer and seemed, at least on the face of them, to have been pretty successful in terms of, trying to pull Donald Trump over to the recognition that the United States has a role to play in securing the future of Ukraine. And that is obviously not at all what we've seen go on here. And I do think we have to think long and hard now about this deal. This deal was first broached by Zelensky last year. It seems to have been Waltz and Rubio who tried to bring it up again as a means to get Donald Trump on board, because we know he likes to make deals, and this would allow us to get as many rare earth minerals maybe as China, or at least move in that direction. But all along the way, he has been no friend of Vladimir Zelensky or Ukraine. And of course, now he has a vice president who has long expressed consternation about our support of Ukraine. So, as we watch this go down, I am not so sure that it is going to be resurrected quite as easily as some people think, because for Donald Trump, this is, a sense that he has long had, that there are points at which Vladimir Putin has spoken that he reiterates often, and he has a very, very different view of the war in Ukraine than the United States has expressed prior.
Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors on a Breaking News Friday here in Washington, D.C. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We want to bring you back to the White House right now. You just saw President Zelensky's SUV with a van carrying the Ukrainian delegation head right down the driveway out of the complex, as Rick said, across Lafayette Park to the Hay Adams Hotel. They drove right by our tent on the North Lawn, where we find Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall right now with the latest. What else is going on there, Tyler?
Well, Joe, just a stark difference from when Zelensky arrived at the White House this morning. He was greeted by an honor guard, 56 service members carrying flags of each of the U.S. states and territories greeted him. I watched him and President Trump have that handshake right in front of the West Wing, and then just how quickly this has devolved. I mean, waiting for Zelensky to come out here on the White House North Lawn, every reporter came out. You could hear a pin drop as we waited for that door to open. Ultimately, with Zelensky coming out, not answering any of our questions. We also saw the rest of his delegation pile into their vans as they slowly drove out of these northwest gates right behind me. So big developments about what happens here next. We're waiting to see if we get any additional information from this White House, if they're going to brief us reporters about what the next steps are coming. But Bloomberg News confirming that that critical minerals deal was not signed, something that President Trump said was critical for the U.S. To move forward when it comes to negotiations to end this war in Ukraine.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House on a historic day. I think we can all say thank you so much. And we want to add the voice now of Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program, with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kelly, we have been checking in with you throughout the duration of this war, which is now, of course, in its fourth year. And we should all bear in mind that the President Zelensky, who we just saw leave the White House, is also leading a country who is still actively at war. And I wonder how this scene playing out, and Vladimir Putin obviously going to be able to bear witness to this, impacts what will actually be happening on the ground. And how things move forward from here.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I will say it's I'm a little speechless having just watched what happened. I think the good news, if there is any at the moment, is that just in the last few days, the Ukrainian government has said publicly that they're able to sustain themselves in terms of funds, equipment, and ammunition for at least the first half of this year. So there won't be an immediate impact on the battlefield in terms of material shortages. The only thing I can anticipate if there, for some reason, the United States cut them off of information, intelligence sharing. We've been providing a lot of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance information that helps the Ukrainians with targeting. And if that was to be cut off, or if they were to lose access to Starlink, which of course is a Musk company, that would have a major impact.
It's pretty remarkable, to your point, Kelly. I never thought we'd be talking about a moment like this. Everyone we're talking with is sharing the same sentiment that you have here. It's like that moment you can't believe you're getting into a fight, or was it? Was that stagecraft at the same time? This is a conversation that a lot of Donald Trump supporters were probably looking forward to hearing and seeing, not fans of President Zelensky, and they don't think that he has been grateful enough. What's your thought?
Yes, I mean, I will say that my interpretation of what happened is I see it as, it looked to me like he was baited, to be honest. I think the administration was probably unhappy with his remarks at Munich, which was sort of a rebuke of the administration. I think they're concerned in the administration that Zelensky is an impediment to peace, that he is the hardest piece in some ways maybe to get peace, because he's still very stuck on ambitious goals for Ukraine that may not be realistic. And I think there's some probably desire to maybe publicly try to rein him in. And this seems to me like it was a tactic. It just seemed like sort of a setup, right? Because he didn't initiate this confrontation. It was initiated by, the vice president. Zelensky did not handle this well, to be very clear. He fell for the bait. That's clear for sure. But I think that, how this plays out, this is a risky strategy. How this plays out with the American public is going to be very interesting, because on the one hand, there's this sense that Zelensky has maybe not been sufficiently grateful. That we've done a lot, but it also looks a little bit like the president is, publicly humiliating a wartime democratic leader of another country, and so how that plays out is hard to say. But this is clearly a very bad moment, and I think the real sign to me will be whether Zelensky stays in D.C. or not, and there's a second meeting, or if he ends up going home.
Well, I guess we're all waiting to find out. Meantime, you're seeing plenty of reaction pouring in on social media, Kelly. The Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, saying, "Dear Zelensky," tagging him on Twitter, "Dear your Ukrainian friends, you are not alone." And with that said, Kelly, we just have a minute left here. But even if the U.S. were to say, all right, we're done with Ukraine now, all of our backing is gone, is Europe able to step in to fill that void?
They can fill a lot of voids, but there are certain niche capabilities like Patriot interceptors, space-based capabilities that they're not able to replace, that only the United States has those.
It's great to have you with us. Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow, Stimson Center, Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, one of many voices of experience we've brought to you over the past couple of hours here on Bloomberg TV and radio. After this meeting in the Oval Office went south, Kayleigh, we'll be back at 5 p.m. Anything could happen between now and then as we try to figure out, as Kelly just mentioned, if they're leaving town or maybe some attempt to get back in a room.
Yeah, we do know that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation have left the White House, but they have not yet left Washington, nor have they made plans to expedite that process, to our knowledge, at least, though they did not, at least at this time, sign that natural resources deal with the United States. Again, that is what was supposed to happen today. We were expecting to see it, in fact, at this hour, and that, of course, is not moving forward, as President Trump is suggesting that Volodymyr Zelensky today is gambling with World War III.
Yeah, we heard some pretty wild rhetoric together. That's what you can expect on this program every day from Washington, D.C. We'll bring it to you unfiltered and live when we can, and we'll let you know what's going on when we get back together. 5 p.m. Eastern here on the fastest show in politics. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everyone, live on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Friday, February 28th. We are wrapping up the month of February. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. And Tim, in this final trading day, safe to say volatility is back.
Yeah, stocks bouncing around on developments out of the White House. Certainly that is top of mind for us, Carol. That bickering between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the U.S. and Ukraine not signing that minerals deal.
All right, that we're going to get to in just a moment. Plus an unexpected drop in U.S. consumer spending, which we know is so important to the U.S. economy. And Tim, we'll also get another view on the U.S. economy.
All that, yeah. We're going to be joined by the CFO of Kava. She's going to talk growth, food cost expansion, and those garlic ranch pita chips. One of your favorites. I know that, Carol Masser.
I love me some garlic. All right, let's get to it, and let's get a check on the trade, because we definitely have seen some reaction to what's come out of the White House today. Over to Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all very much in the red as we wrap up a volatile trading month and a wild Friday to cap it off. Right to the numbers here. We are back in the red, swinging between gains and losses, but the S&P now lower by 9, 58.52 where we stand on the S&P 500 index, down now by 0.1%. We got the Dow down 30, drop there of 0.1%. NASDAQ lower by 45, now down by 0.3%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares down 0.2%. The 10-year 4.21% with a 2-year currently yielding 3.98%. Spot gold down $31 the ounce, 28.46, drop there of 1.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.4%, 70.40 a barrel on WTI, and Bitcoin now higher, up 0.4%, 84,640 in Bitcoin. BlackRock is scrapping its aspirational workforce representation objectives, reversing course on earlier goals after President Trump moved to end diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practices. And we have also got Wells Fargo abandoning its net zero commitment, discontinuing its sector-specific 2030 interim financed emissions targets, and its goal to achieve net zero by 2050 for financed emissions. So again, recapping, a lot of volatility. All of a sudden, the Dow back in the green, up 20, up by 0.1%. The S&P, however, lower, down now by 1 point. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts, and keep it locked into Bloomberg Television and Radio for the very latest. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. Well, news out of Washington, certainly front and center. And at 3 p.m. Wall Street time, Bloomberg's David Weston, host of Wall Street Week, will be talking live with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, 3 o'clock on Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg Radio.
And on that, we start in the nation's capital. The U.S. and Ukraine, as Tim mentioned earlier, did not sign a minerals deal as many expected on developing Ukraine's natural resources. This is according to a U.S. official. The outcome following a heated exchange earlier at the White House between President Trump, Ukrainian President Zelensky, and Vice President J.D. Vance.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war,
you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting?
Times.
No, in this
Even
entire
today.
meeting, have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
All right, that, of course, is President Trump, President Zelensky, and Vice President J.D. Vance earlier from the Oval Office. We should point out that the Ukrainian delegation has left the White House. We do want to get kind of a rundown of where we are in the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, what might come next. Back with us in our Washington, D.C. bureaus, Bloomberg News senior White House and politics correspondent Gregory Cordy. Gregory, President Trump, President Zelensky, Vice President J.D. Vance arguing in the Oval Office. bickering between world leaders in front of reporters. I would even go as far to argue behind closed doors. That just doesn't typically happen, does it?
Yeah, I've covered the White House in one way or another for more than a decade, and obviously have watched Oval Office meetings like this on TV for decades before that. I'm struggling to think of a single meeting between world leaders that I've ever seen that devolved as quickly and as contentiously as that one did. The bickering, the tone. And you just showed sort of the middle of it. It started off actually pretty cordial. President Trump has an ability to tailor his message to the world leader that is coming into the Oval Office. And it was really Vice President J.D. Vance who kind of pulled the pin on a rhetorical grenade and just dropped it on the floor, saying that Zelensky should be thanking the United States, that he's in no room to bargain. And that's really when the meeting went off the rails. He left without the critical minerals deal being signed, and really with the future of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, and indeed the war with Russia very much hanging in the balance.
So it raises the question where these three countries are left off. We did hear from the president following that meeting in the Oval Office. He did say that he's determined that President Zelensky is not ready for peace if America is involved. He says he disrespected the United States of America. He can come back when he is ready for peace. Where does this leave the war in Ukraine?
Well, obviously, it leaves it continuing to go on without the sort of the offices of the United States trying to broker some kind of a deal. But the real question is, where is the U.S. support after this? Does President Trump really just sort of cut Ukraine off from any kind of U.S. assistance, say that it's Europe's problem, and really leave Ukraine at the mercy of Russian troops? Trump pressed Zelensky on the issue of conscription, of how he's having to increasingly draft more and more forces to come to the Russian front, saying he's in a bad position, no position to negotiate. Zelensky himself admitted, obviously, when you're in a war, you have problems, and manpower and conscripting troops is certainly one of them. This is a war of attrition that's been going on for 3 years. Both sides have been depleted, but obviously Russia, with the bigger country, probably has the advantage the longer this war goes on.
We should point out a headline crossing that Mexico is open to new tariffs on China to avoid those duties expected from the Trump administration. Hey, Gregory, not sure what anyone gets out of geopolitically, of having a public fight, but just wondering, since we are living in unusual times, many would argue, might there be some performance element to this? Can we even dare to go there?
You're right to ask that question, and I think if I'm a world leader or even a citizen of the United States and I'm watching that meeting, I think you should have the same question. Even Trump at the end of that exchange said, "Well, this is made for great television." There's a performance aspect to everything that President Trump does. And I'm not saying that critically at all. He's a guy who comes from the world of tabloid coverage in New York City. He's been in the public limelight his entire life, and he was a TV star on The Apprentice, where conflict in a boardroom was a whole part of the plot, right? And so this is perhaps an extension of that. Perhaps this is part of the art of the deal. But even so, we've seen Trump in a lot of these kinds of meetings that did not go as far as this one, really off the rails and towards a very acrimonious exchange there.
Gregory, I'm so glad you brought up his book, Art of the Deal. And again, not speaking out of turn, but President Trump likes to make deals. So can we assume that walking away, the fight that came out, he expected, I would assume, a deal to be made. And so can we still assume that he wants to make a deal so that he can help bring this war to an end?
You know, there's two people who can answer that, and that's Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump. You know, anytime you have two principals like this that depart a meeting as contentious as this one, you know, one side is going to have to break the ice and reach out to the other side and see if there's something that they can salvage here. It's unclear to me, obviously, at this hour, just, the minutes after Zelensky has been, by all appearances, kicked out of the White House, where that overture would come from, whether there's an olive leaf, an olive branch, left to be extended to try to put something back together while Zelensky is still in town.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Hey, one thing I was thinking was the role of J.D. Vance in this Oval Office meeting. And look, nothing typical happened in this meeting today. No question about that. There's nothing typical about this entire situation. But still, I was pretty surprised to see the vice president take such an active role. Did that surprise you?
It did. I was on Joe Matthews' show, Balance of Power, at noon, and we opened this meeting with me saying, look, this is a meeting of two world leaders. They will try to find some common ground, as world leaders always do. And that's the way the meeting started. And then, in an almost cinematic way, the camera zoomed back out, and we saw that Vance was on the couch. At least when I started watching this meeting, I wasn't even aware that Vance was in the room. And then as Vance began to talk, he's the one who really kind of took this in a different direction. And it's a very interesting role for him. He seems to have carved out a national security specialty in this first month of the Trump administration, giving that speech at the Munich Security Conference, doing a little tour of Europe, talking to our friends and allies. But he's also been a long-time Ukraine critic and a skeptic of U.S. involvement in helping Ukraine fight this war with Russia. And so his very involvement of this probably should have presaged that this meeting was not going to go as well as maybe Volodymyr Zelensky had hoped.
All right, so Gregory, we've seen President Zelensky exiting the White House. Do we know, is the Ukrainian delegation expected to go back to Ukraine today, tomorrow? Do we know anything about what this weekend looks like now?
Yeah, that's something that I can't answer, except to say that these meetings increasingly involve more than just the President of the United States. They involve, obviously, the State Department's going to be involved, but also, Zelensky has been very astute in public diplomacy in dealing with the West, and particularly the United States, forging relationships on Capitol Hill, forging relationships in civil society. We understand that his scheduled interview with Fox News tonight is still on as of at least half an hour or so ago when Fox News tweeted out that they have not heard anything to the contrary. And so he's going to try to continue to build at least public support and congressional support for the Ukrainian war effort, even if that support is not going to come from the person who matters most, who is President Donald Trump.
I wonder if perhaps there could be an unscheduled visit to Mar-a-Lago over the weekend. Again, I don't know anything about this. I'm just speculating here about his time here in the United States. Gregory, where does this leave Volodymyr Zelensky in terms of what he goes back to Ukraine and tells his country? What's his message to NATO following this meeting?
Yeah, that's going to be a tough return because he arguably returns to Europe in a worse place than when he got here. At the very least, in this kind of diplomatic situations, you just want to do no harm. Even if you don't make progress, you don't want to end up in a worse position. And he's arguably in a much worse position than when he started. And he's going to have to, if the support is not going to come from the United States, he's going to have to pass the hat in Europe, which is, frankly, Western Europe has its own problems, its own economic difficulties. This may be exactly what President Trump intends, right? He's been talking for a month and indeed for years about the need for Europe to come to the table and pay more of their fair share towards collective security, to make more guarantees of aid to Ukraine, to not have the United States foot the bill, and that may be where this discussion goes next.
Hey, real quickly, Gregory, the U.S., whoever's in the White House, is the leader of the free world, the head of the world's largest and still most significant economy in the world, the country, the leadership that the world turns to in terms of crisis and turmoil. What are the geopolitical implications of this? And if you could, just in 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's something that every world leader is going to have to decide for themselves. The entire world has gotten to know Donald Trump, gotten to know his leadership style and his rhetorical style. They've all tried to develop their own direct relationships with Trump. But certainly, if you're a friend, ally, adversary, you're looking at this meeting for signals about how you're going to deal with Trump the next time you happen to be the one in that hot seat in the Oval Office.
All right, going to leave it there. Gregory, thank you so much. And we should point out to everybody that Gregory Cordy has a great series of stories about what's going on at the Social Security shakeup. They are seeing officials leave, and we highly recommend you check it out at Bloomberg.com and go to the Bloomberg terminal. Gregory Cordy, senior White House correspondent and politics correspondent here at Bloomberg News.
Our world, certainly one eye on Washington, the other on Wall Street and the economy. This is U.S. consumers unexpectedly pulled back on spending on goods, such as cars in January, amid extreme winter weather, and a slowdown in services, which, if sustained, may raise concerns about the resilience of the economy. Meantime, the core PCE price index, it's the Fed's preferred measure of underlying inflation. It rose 0.3% from December and 2.6% from last year, matching the smallest annual increase since early 2021. Not the only U.S. data we got today, but a key focal point certainly on this. For more on the data, we have Bloomberg News economics editor Molly Smith in the studio. Molly, inflation as expected, but seemed like everybody's talking about this real personal spending number for January, down more than forecast.
Yeah, that was really the big dent in this report. I mean, we were expecting a small decline in inflation-adjusted spending, but this was much worse than what the forecast had called for. And I think, you know what, of course, this is just 1 month of data. And at this point, you know, tomorrow's March. This is looking at January data. So this is a while ago. But you look at how, if this pattern plays out going forward, that if we're seeing spending falling, I mean, this is an economy here in the U.S. that's driven by consumer spending. This is like what really is the bedrock of what our entire economic activity is about. So when you see the spending numbers like this today, that obviously raises concerns going forward. But at least I think if there's any comfort to take from this, it did seem very isolated to cars.
Okay.
Granted, yes, services spending did slow down, but it wasn't nearly as drastic as the drop in spending on cars. And of course, when you have a weather month like that, you know, the fires perhaps in LA, when it was so cold in so many parts of the country, people just don't want to go out. They don't want to be spending money. It's okay, like we want to just be in our houses, whatever, maybe to the extent that spending can rebound in February. Who knows? Next month, this could be a very different discussion.
I lived in my pajamas like on the weekend because it was so cold.
I get that.
Full disclosure.
Were you saving money?
Not buying cars.
Ordering some stuff in, perhaps. But hey, listen, what's funny is I thought we were going to be talking first and foremost about the inflation number today.
I thought so too.
Fed's preferred inflation gauge, smack on in terms of what economists were predicting.
Yes. So I think, and you know, the thing about, again, the fact that PCE comes so late in the month, we've already gotten the CPI report and the PPI report.
So we know the inputs.
It's really hard to miss the estimate on this one, you know? Like there's already, it's so much of it has been telegraphed.
You're dropping the mic, economists.
I mean, especially when this
like
one
the
comes at
there.
like, you know, we also get like quarterly data on this too. So when we get like the one in March and we've already seen what the first quarter estimate's going to be like, would be really hard to miss the estimate on this. So yes, hard to, you know, miss that one. And in general, yes, inflation, maybe it's cooling, but it's still just so slow.
Well, it's not 2%.
It's so sticky.
It's not 2%, and that's what the Fed wants to see.
Correct. 2.6 is not 2, and they're not going to be happy until it's 2%.
Sticky. Yeah, 2%.
That's
folks.
the word.
Unless they change it. Haven't done it, right?
That's not happening.
That's not happening.
No.
All right, Molly Smith, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Molly Smith, economics editor at Bloomberg News, a real go-to for us on all things the U.S. economy. All right, when we come back, the C-suite watching all that is going on both Washington and Wall Street. It's a full plate, everybody. So what might it all mean for the hottest name, Tim, in the restaurant space?
We're going to ask the CFO of Cava, who's going to be here in just a few minutes. Meantime, we're seeing stocks in the red, but the Dow is higher, really searching for direction in most of the equity market today. The S&P 500 barely down. We can go ahead and call that flat. The NASDAQ down 0.2%. The Dow, Carol, up by just 0.1%.
You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, recapping and resetting on major developments today out of the White House. You heard it right here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Plans to sign a critical minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine were scrapped after Donald Trump's meeting with Vladimir Zelensky quickly devolved into a fiery exchange over the Ukrainian leader's doubts that the U.S. president's efforts to broker a deal with Russia will yield lasting peace. A volatile session with the S&P swinging between gains and losses, right now unchanged on the day at 5860. The Dow now higher by 20, also little changed. NASDAQ down 34, a drop there of 0.2%. The 10-year at 4.22%, the 2-year 3.99%. Spot gold down $33 the ounce, down 1.1%. 28.44. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%. 69.82 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin now at 84,383, up 0.1%. Intel further delaying the opening of a much-touted new semiconductor complex in Ohio, marking the latest setback to the chipmaker's expansion plans. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master, Tim Stanovic, live here on Bloomberg Business Week. Well, U.S. corporate earnings are still trickling out from companies. We know NVIDIA, a very big focus this past week. Among the others reporting, Cava Group. It's the fast casual Mediterranean-inspired restaurant chain that has been one of the hottest, if not the hottest, in the space. Revenue nearly doubled over the past 3 years. The company went public in June of 2023, and its shares, Tim, surged until a recent slide.
With more on Cava's business and outlook, we got the CFO of Cava, Tricia Tolliver, who's featured in the weekly Bloomberg CFO Briefing newsletter. It comes out on Sunday. Tricia is in Washington, D.C. Along with us is Bloomberg News senior editor Nina Tretman, who joins us here in the studio. Nina, Tricia, welcome to both of you. I do want to start with consumer spending and what the environment looks like, because we did get the data today that show that overall consumers pulled back on spending much more than expected in January. Tricia, what can you tell us about consumer spending? Do you see signs of slowing?
So we're very fortunate here at Cava. Our consumer has been very resilient. So what we believe that's attributed to is our strong value proposition, where the quality of our food, the relevance of our cuisine, Mediterranean diet, #1 diet, top 8 years running, as well as the convenience of coming to Cava whenever, wherever, and however you want it, and the experience, where it's just an incredible place to interact with our team members, enjoy amazing cuisine, and feel good after doing so. So when we look at our consumer at Cava, we find that they are continuing to spend. In the fourth quarter, our traffic was up 15.6%, and those consumers were spending with increased premium attachments, adding things like our craveable pita chips, as well as seeing strong incidence in premium items like steak. And so that's really telling us that the consumer feels good about what they're spending, which we're not hearing in a lot of other places. Another cut of data that we looked at is looking at all of our restaurants based on income cohort. And we're actually finding strength in the lower income cohorts, where those restaurants, same restaurant sales, were slightly above the overall average for the rest of the fleet.
Tricia, just a quick follow-up. So then you mentioned the fourth quarter, what you've been seeing. What have you been seeing this year and in the current quarter? Is that consumer spending holding up?
Yeah, we have seen strength in our consumer spending, and that's given us the confidence to deliver a guidance that suggests that our same restaurant sales will be 6 to 8% in 2025. And in fact, a 1-year same restaurant sales in Q1 is expected to be above that, and then moderating slightly into Q2, 3, and 4 due to the strength that we delivered in 2024 during those quarters.
Tricia, talk to us a bit about your costs. Of course, labor is an important part of the cost equation, and you've introduced a new labor model to help drive that down. Talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. So we have introduced a new labor model, and one of the things that's just incredible about Cava is the strength of our overall economic model. Delivering 25% restaurant level margins allows us to make investments in team members and investments in guests. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about team members is making sure that we're providing the appropriate pay and benefits that allow us to be a best-in-class employer. And the labor model is one example where we're able to take those team member hours and redistribute them throughout the day such that we're providing team members direct access with our guests at peak times. So think about it where we're taking hours that once were earlier in the day and preparing items for prep before the restaurant opened and redistributing those during peak times so that we can provide better speed and service for our guests overall. So when we look at that and think about costs themselves, our labor costs are expected to increase low to mid single digits, and we want to make sure that we're deploying those precious hours as best that we can. We often say that we view our team members as assets and not expenses and want to make sure that we're leaning into them in the right way.
Tricia, does it always work? I always wonder about these models, right? Like, it's great to look at systems and redo, but I mean, does it always work, or are there times when it can be a little off?
Yeah, when deployed properly, we find that it works. There's always opportunities to improve and enhance, but when you have the right people in the right places at the right time, we're seeing great success with this model.
Tricia, to follow up on costs, we've been talking a lot about increases in inflation. We've talked about egg prices. I know that Carver doesn't really use eggs, but where else do you see cost pressures in the business, especially when it comes to food?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. We're very fortunate at Cava. Our basket of input costs that comprise our food, beverage, and packaging costs is very diverse. So 25% is protein, 25% produce, 25% grocery, and 25% is everything else. And so with that diverse basket, we're fairly insulated from significant changes in any one area of input costs. And so in 2025, we're expecting low single-digit inflation costs in our basket overall.
We're keeping an eye on what's happening in Washington, and I'm wondering about policies out of the Trump administration that you're keeping an eye on. We just spent a lot of time talking about the lack of a deal reached between the U.S. and Ukraine when it comes to minerals and natural resources. Volodymyr Zelensky sending out a tweet just moments ago saying that Ukraine needs just and lasting peace, but he did thank the U.S. and President Trump for his support and for the visit. How do you watch what's happening out of Washington, and what policies specifically affect you and your business?
Yes, certainly every administration brings change, and we want to keep a watchful eye on that. At Cava, we're focused on building a sustainable, durable, long-term brand. In recent weeks, we've been paying a close eye on tariffs as well as immigration, and certainly believe we've got a wonderful plan in place to be able to assess whatever may happen in this very fluid situation appropriately.
So tariffs won't impact you?
So when we look at tariffs and what has been proposed, and again mentioned that it was quite fluid, I'll go back to our basket. Our basket is very diverse, so there's not a high concentration of items in any one area, and the vast majority of our products are sourced domestically. And while we do import products from Mexico, Canada, and China, they're a very small portion of our overall basket and input costs themselves. And the tariffs, as they're currently explained, are not anticipated to have a material impact on our business overall.
Even though it's not anticipated to have a material impact, is it possible for you to source what you do source from Mexico and China? Is it possible for you to source that domestically? Can you just take those out of your supply chain?
In certain cases, there's possible to find those items outside of those areas that are currently projected to have tariffs, and the supply chain team is doing a great job partnering with current suppliers and others to ensure that we have alternate sources of product in the event that it becomes a material impact to the business overall.
One thing I want to ask you, and I just want to go back to DC for a moment, because I think for those of us who've been covering U.S. politics, the White House for many, many years, that is an unusual thing to see two world leaders bickering and the optics of it. And I want to go back to, at times of uncertainty, and we see it play out in the financial markets, the volatility has come back, certainly. We look to leaders to kind of take us forward. And I just wonder, you are a leader within the corporate community. I mean, does that kind of behavior embarrass you as a leader in the United States? And does it, I don't know, impact anything in terms of how you run your business or how you think about it?
Yeah, at Kava, human connection is so important to us. Again, it's all about welcoming people to our table. And so our focus is creating an environment where everyone feels welcome and can enjoy an incredible meal. And so at Kava, that's something that we're encouraging our team members to do and create that incredible Kava hospitality and serve our amazing cuisine and continue to drive overall performance and bringing more and more people together.
Maybe to follow up on that, you have had success in recent quarters with special items, like, for example, the steak that you pointed out in your earnings. How much does that drive revenue, and how often should we expect novelties like that to be added to the menu?
Yeah, so it's important to us on an annual basis to have one tentpole moment. So a key item that's introduced, like steak in 2024, surrounded by a couple of seasonal moments where we can feature other items. For example, our garlic ranch pita chips last quarter. And so that creates the innovation and excitement around the menu that keeps our guests coming back into the restaurant and drives those great traffic results that I mentioned earlier. So certainly evaluating those opportunities and presenting them to create a compelling reason to continue to come to Kava more and more often.
Trisha, forgive me, but more out of DC because we're just following everything that's happening there closely.
Welcome to our world.
It
feels like we move forward on like economic and market fundamentals and then get pulled into everything out of DC.
I was struck yesterday because I saw a tweet, or perhaps it was earlier than yesterday, from the Secretary of HHS, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who mentioned, I believe it was a restaurant, Steak and Shake, for removing seed oils from their menu and going with beef tallow instead. We did see your competitor Sweetgreen announce recently that they're getting rid of seed oils and they're going with more olive oil. Are you making any changes to your menu based on this sort of trend of moving away from seed oils, going exclusively with olive oil? Do you watch what's happening from the Secretary of HHS?
We certainly watch what's happening, and what we believe is important is the quality of those seed oils that we do have. Our seed oils are cold pressed and do not have the chemical processing that others may have in their seed oils. So we're providing fresh, clean ingredients for our guests, and that's something that we feel very strongly about, and we'll continue to deliver that Kava cuisine in a very impactful way.
Trisha, the other thing I would say is that, coming off of earnings season, one of the things we've focused on is certainly what folks had to say about news out of Washington, but what their CapEx plans were, what their expansion plans were, which gives us a great indication of, the optimism within the corporate sector. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing in terms of expansion and where, what you are planning to spend money on.
Yeah, so we've been really fortunate. In 2024, we opened 59 restaurants, 58 net new restaurants. And in 2025, we expect to open between 62 and 66 restaurants, which is at least a 17% growth. So that's certainly an opportunity for us to lean into CapEx spend consistently and continue to deliver positive free cash flow as we move forward. There will be other enhancements as well that we'll be investing in. So additional technologies in the restaurants to improve speed and service in the restaurant and ultimately deliver a better guest experience.
What's your favorite thing to eat at the restaurant?
Oh my gosh, it actually changed quite frequently. There's so many amazing things to eat. So with 17 billion combinations, it's really, truly exciting. But right now I'm enjoying our lamb meatballs and our crazy feta, as well as tzatziki on my bowl.
Oh my God, I'm starving. All right, gonna leave it there. Trisha, thank you so much for all the time. And thank you for really going around our world as well as your world. Really appreciate it. Trisha Tolliver, she's Chief Financial Officer at Kava, joining us from Washington, D.C. And of course, our thanks as always to our Nina Trentman, Senior Editor at Bloomberg News. Be sure to catch the Bloomberg CFO Briefing newsletter. It does come out of Sunday, and it features Trisha in it, as well as the conversation she had with Nina. So look forward to that.
Well, let's get back to developments out of D.C. now. Plans to sign a critical minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine were scrapped after Donald Trump's meeting Friday with Volodymyr Zelensky. It quickly devolved into a fire exchange over the Ukrainian leader's doubts that the U.S. president's efforts to broker a deal with Russia would yield lasting peace. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. First, though, we got to get an update on what's happening with these markets. Here he is, Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. It has been a volatile day, a day of fast-moving developments out of Washington. Let's bring you up to date right now. In the meantime, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is now thanking the United States and President Trump for support. In a post on X, Zelensky said Ukraine needs a just and lasting peace. Now, all of this after a shocking White House exchange between the president and Vladimir Zelensky, an exchange in which President Trump berated Vladimir Zelensky for being, quote, disrespectful. The key takeaway from that meeting, plans to sign a critical minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine were scrapped after the meeting devolved into a fiery exchange over the Ukrainian leader's doubts that the president's efforts to broker a deal with Russia would yield a lasting peace. So here's where we stand right now. We have been swinging between gains and losses, but the S&P up 18 right now, up 0.3%. The Dow up 147, also up 0.3%, while NASDAQ up 37, a gain of 0.2%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares higher right now by 0.1%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.22%, the 2-year dipping below 4%, 3.99% right now. Spot gold down 1%, 28.47 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1%, 69.66 a barrel on this Friday, final trading day of the month. Bitcoin right now up 0.3%, 84,525 on Bitcoin. Microsoft is signaling the end of the line for Skype, the iconic internet calling and chat service that it bought almost 14 years ago, and Delta Airlines adding new service to Morocco and Nigeria. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. Well, you heard the latest from Charlie there. Zelensky departing the White House following the public spat and a planned signing ceremony and press conference were canceled. Joining us now is Joe Matthew, co-host of Balance of Power. He's with us from Washington, D.C. Joe, I want to go right to, just in the last few minutes, hearing from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, out with a post on X. He says, "Thank you, America. Thank you for your support. Thank you for this visit. Thank you, POTUS, Congress, and the American people. Ukraine needs just and lasting peace, and we are working exactly for that." Does that mean this is the end of this visit to the United States?
Unclear. We're still waiting to find out if he plans to leave Washington. Tim, he has left the White House complex. He wasn't staying at Blair House the way we saw Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, but at the Hay Adams Hotel on the other side of Lafayette Park. Not a mention, not a word to reporters who had gathered in the driveway. And by the way, there's a large crowd of reporters who have gathered at the stakeout location outside the West Wing once again now. We're trying to get a handle on why exactly. But they're holed up, as far as we know, in the hotel and making their plans, I guess. Maybe there's a conversation with the White House about getting back together, but I'd say that's pretty unlikely after what we saw. Donald Trump, of course, and J.D. Vance, by the way, the vice president, is the first one who brought up the fact that he had not heard President Zelensky say thank you in this meeting. That's when things started to get chippy. So there you have it. Thank you to America, as you say, for this visit. Thank you to POTUS, Congress, the American people. So I guess he heard the message today in the Oval.
All right. Well, on that, let's take everyone to the Oval Office when President Trump was meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, along with Vice President J.D. Vance. This was a couple of hours ago. Let's listen in and see some of that exchange.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now the President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact
2015.
2014.
2014 and 2014.
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
that's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, the situation the same. The people have been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him. A lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him, me, like a new president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go We signed him with gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Count one.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens.
All right, folks, we're going to come out of this. We do want to go live to the White House. That's where we find Republican Senator of the state of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, making some comments.
J.D. Vance, standing up for our country. We want to be helpful. What I saw in the Oval Office was disrespectful, and I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again. I think most Americans saw a guy that they would not want to go in business with. The way he handled the meeting, the way he confronted the president was just over the top. So I think the relationship between Ukraine and America is important, vitally important. But can Zelensky do a deal with the United States? After what I saw, I don't know.
What would he need to do, sir? Good question.
Senator Graham. You spent lunch with President Trump. What did he say to you about his interactions and whether he thinks
he was shocked? He was very upbeat. I told Zelensky, we'll talk about security guarantees. We'll talk about ceasefires and how the war ends. This is a process. You have a new relationship with America, a $500 billion, $500 billion deal that President Trump is proud of, that gives us an interest worth defending. Let's talk about the positive. But he was terrible at Munich, Zelensky, and I think he has made it almost impossible to sell to the American people that he's a good investment, that he is a good business.
You calling for last question. Senator Graham. Senator, a number of European. Hey, one at a time. One at a time. Christian Daytime.
Senator Graham, thank you. Do you think President Zelensky needs to resign to resume these peace talks?
He either needs to resign and send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change.
Do you
All right, everybody, you have been listening to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham outside the White House there. Of course, the Republican from the state of South Carolina saying that he thinks the relationship between Ukraine and America is an important one, but he says, can President Zelensky now do a deal with the United States? I do not know. He did talk about having a conversation with Zelensky and talking about security guarantees and other issues. But at this point, as we know, we have seen the negotiations, at least, or the conversations between the U.S. and Ukraine, they have broken off.
I do want to go back to Joe Matthew of Balance of Power. He joins us in our Washington, D.C. bureau. Lindsey Graham, a big defender of supporting funding for Ukraine within the Republican Party, Joe. What does it mean for him to make statements such as these?
Yeah, it's significant that we just heard from Lindsey Graham. That could have been any number of so-called MAGA Republicans who have long had trouble with the idea of sending more money and weapons to Ukraine. This was what you call the Ukraine hawk. After Mitch McConnell and maybe John Thune in the United States Senate, someone who actually agreed with Joe Biden when it came to arming the Ukrainians, not always on the way that it was carried out. In fact, was the one to push for F-16s, for instance, for M1 Abrams tanks when others were doubting their effectiveness, for longer range missiles, bringing the fight to Russia. He's a Ukraine hawk. He's a Russia hawk. And to see him in the driveway just hours after President Zelensky rolled out without taking a single question from reporters, apparently instructed to leave the White House complex, it tells us a lot about where we are now. You're hearing questions about him potentially resigning. I don't know if that's where we're going here, but it is not looking like we're going to have a rekindling of the flame on this trip. We're still waiting to find out, as we discussed earlier, guys, if he's about to leave Washington.
I mean, how do you figure out when, things that there will be no more conversations at this point? I mean, how do we figure that out? How can we I don't know, what are the channels of diplomacy that are now being pursued, possibly behind closed doors, and maybe not playing out in front of reporters?
It's probably more back channels at this point. The entire delegation was shown the door. They opened the gate and sent them packing today. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, though, did have the national security team in the room, including Mike Walls, another, by the way, Ukraine hawk. And so they're probably having conversations right now. It's not a mistake that Lindsey Graham ends up at the White House on an afternoon like this. And I suspect that we'll get a statement later on. The joint news conference that Trump and Zelensky were going to be holding has, of course, been canceled. So we've, frankly, got our eyes on Truth Social right now, and whether we get a statement further from the White House, more than what we've heard, at least. I will remind everybody that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is going to be with us here in the Bureau not too long from now for a conversation with David Westin. Remember, it was Bessent who brought that minerals deal to Kyiv just a couple of weeks ago and left empty-handed. He may be the closest we get to the sun today in finding out what the heck is going on.
Well, I also thought it was interesting. Where is Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, in all of this?
Well, look, again, you've got a Ukraine hawk there, but he's also Donald Trump's Secretary of State. That's why you saw him, carrying the line at the UN earlier this week that upset a lot of Ukraine hawks to not blame Russia and its motivations here for having started the war. You heard Donald Trump earlier today in the Oval say that he's with both sides here, both Russia and Ukraine. So look, things have changed a lot since Joe Biden left the White House. But even when you look at the Ukraine hawks, like Rubio, they're still part of the Trump administration, and they're very much delivering his message.
Joe, it's about close to 11 p.m. in Moscow right now. Vladimir Putin, how's he watching events such as this unfold?
It was our Republican strategist, our contributor, Rick Davis, who said earlier that they are high-fiving at the Kremlin today. This was a loss, I think you can argue, for both Ukraine and the United States when it comes to the publicity around this, the public nature of this, and the chaos that it kind of represents here. This was not a good day for decorum in the Oval Office to hear voices raised, and it certainly raises a lot of doubts right now about the way forward. This minerals deal today was supposed to then lead to talks. And Donald Trump said he just spoke to Vladimir Putin another time about this, and they've had lengthy conversations about it. It's just unclear how we get to the peace table when the Ukrainian delegation is driving out of the White House complex with its tail between its legs.
I guess, I just think about the optics of the whole week, Joe, in terms of the meeting with President Emmanuel Macron of France, and then, of course, the UK Prime Minister. And I think it was just the assumption that this was all going to kind of wrap up or take a big step forward on Friday. And yet here we are.
This was supposed to be the bow on top, right? It was all done. All the work was done.
Right.
And we knew that as soon as this conversation started, Carol, and we started hearing Zelensky say, wait, I need more than this. This document is not enough.
Yeah.
Like, this meeting may not be going the way they planned. These are typically very carefully choreographed. And to see it melt down like that was quite remarkable. And it says a lot about the frustration and the tension between these two leaders.
All right, Joe, we so appreciate it. A busy day for you guys. It's all been unfolding right in front of us. Joe Matthew, of course, one of the co-hosts of Balance of Power. And, of course, he'll be coming your way once again at 5 p.m. Wall Street time with a wrap-up and tie-up of where we are in terms of D.C. and the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine.
In the meantime, taking a look at the markets, we're actually seeing close to session highs on the S&P 500, up 0.5 percentage point. The NASDAQ composite up 0.5 percentage point as well, while Dow Jones Industrial Average up 0.4%. Of 1%.
Yep, we have seen a little bit of a move up or bouncing around too of the VIX. It was up more than 1 point at 1 point above 21, but settling down. But a lot of movement, I would say, in terms of kind of responding to what we are getting out of DC. We continue.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovec live here in our Bloomberg New York headquarters. Of course, front and center is what's happening in D.C. or what's not happening, because we anticipated that Ukraine and the United States would be signing some sort of minerals deal, natural resources deal, but that did not happen after a heated exchange between President Trump and President Zelensky of the Ukraine. Let's get to it with our own Bloomberg News national security team leader, Nick Wadhams. Nick, gosh, what an interesting day, not playing out as many expected. Top of mind right now, and what might come next?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, what happens now? So does Trump essentially turn his back on Zelensky? What happens to the prospects for a ceasefire deal? We know that this planned signing ceremony for a deal that was going to involve an economic partnership over critical minerals and other natural resources is off. So I think, the big question is this a relationship already obviously a little bit hostile is that now entirely broken? And what does President Trump do from here? Throw himself further in with the Russian side and essentially clear the way for further Russian advances, or situation and get the U.S. back in Ukraine's corner?
Is the way to salvage this situation for Zelensky to resign, for a new new Ukrainian leader, to emerge?
Well, what you saw just now, President Zelensky sent a tweet essentially saying thank you to the U.S. and thank you to President Trump. So he appears to still be trying to find a way out. But clearly, President Trump does not like him, and they have called for him to hold new elections. That is, however, very much a Russian talking point. Russia wants him out and believes that he should hold new elections, in part because, according to analysts, they could then influence the election and get someone who's more sympathetic to Russia in that office. So, so much of Zelensky's legitimacy, he does retain pretty broad support back home. So much of his legitimacy and Ukraine's sense of stability would be totally undercut if he steps down. So you can be pretty sure that's something that would be very strongly resisted in Ukraine.
That tweet, though, was sent before we heard from Senator Lindsey Graham outside of the White House, who did say in comments that he doesn't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again.
Right. Lindsey Graham, obviously just one voice. There are other Republicans who have come out in his favor. Obviously, you have Democrats as well. But yes, what does President Trump say? That's it? Not going to talk to him again? Certainly seems like he and J.D. Vance feel that way. But can they be talked back from the ledge from folks like Marco Rubio and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, some others in the administration, to say, hey, listen, let's try to do a deal here? And maybe President Zelensky does something. If he shows this sort of gratitude that Trump and Vance called for, is this something where he can get back into Trump's good graces? Just so many questions right now.
Nick, is NATO members picking up the phone and calling the White House? I just think again about this week. France's president, Emmanuel Macron here, the UK prime minister was here. This whole kind of lead up to what we expected would be some kind of minerals deal, a first big step in maybe putting an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. So should we anticipate that NATO has got to be looking at all of this front and center, and all of the leaders over in Europe? What are we anticipating? What might we hear from them?
Right. I think the big issue really is going to be that they are going to try to have to step up for Ukraine. I don't think there's going to be a ton where they're going to be able to convince President Trump. He hasn't shown a huge willingness to listen to them, at least from his public comments. So the question really is going to be, okay, how do they step up and support Ukraine, whether that's with more diplomatic support or military support? And is that something that intimidates Russia at all? There is more they could do, but you can very much get the sense that the conversations in Europe now are going to be how they fill the gap that's being vacated by the United States.
So how do they do that? Do they have the money to do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, they do have money. There's a fair amount more they can do, but there's also the possibility of some sort of security guarantee. Obviously, that opens the door to a much wider conflict, especially if the U.S. isn't in the background. But again, I think these are going to be conversations all through the weekend and into next week for European leaders.
Hey, Nick, one of the things I keep thinking about is, this is the president of the United States bickering with another world leader. The president, the leader of the free world, the leader of the world's biggest economy. It's important in terms of geopolitics. It's important in terms of the global economy. What are potentially the geopolitical implications? What are the U.S. national security implications, if any? And we've just got about 30 seconds.
Well, I think the big question there is, what do allies and adversaries take from the U.S. when you have such a sudden policy shift from the United States, from Trump and then to Biden and then back to Trump again? Can they rely on constancy in the U.S.? Can they rely on a president making a promise and that promise being carried over for more than just one term? And then even into the next term, when you have someone like President Trump essentially reorienting foreign policy so quickly, is this a partner they can trust?
All right, going to leave it on that note. I know very busy on your end. Nick, thank you so much for squeezing us in. Bloomberg News National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams out there in D.C. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this hour of Bloomberg Business Week. If you're watching on TV, the close is coming your way in just a moment. Of course, this story front and center for us. Markets, though, have definitely rebounded off their lows of the session. Tim and I continuing right here on Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Yes, indeed, everybody. We are just about 59 minutes away from the closing bell on this Friday. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec, live in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. This is Bloomberg Business Week, and we've got markets, Tim, bouncing around.
Yeah, we certainly do. The S&P 500, though, in the green, higher by about 0.6%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 0.5 percentage point right now. The NASDAQ higher by 0.5 percentage point as well.
As we've been saying, front and center, a breakdown of talks following a heated exchange between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office at the White House. That expected minerals and natural resources deal not happening, at least at this moment. In just a minute, a Bloomberg exclusive with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. David Weston will talk with the secretary about these latest developments and more. I'm sure they'll talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. But again, David Weston with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in just a moment.
As a reminder, Zelensky departed the White House following that public spat, and a planned signing ceremony and press conference were canceled. U.S. officials said the minerals deal with Trump had cast as a necessary step to repay American support as he sought to broker a deal with Vladimir Putin was not signed before Zelensky's departure.
It was widely expected. We've seen, two big global leaders at the White House this week, and this was expected to be kind of the culmination of those efforts. So interesting to see it hasn't played out. We have seen some reaction earlier. We saw stocks under some pressure following that heated exchange, but we've bounced off of those lows. All right, folks, let's get to that conversation. We have David Weston, of course, of Bloomberg, who's joined by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in D.C.
For our Bloomberg audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. I'm delighted to welcome now the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He's Mr. Scott Bessent. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Ukraine is at the top of everyone's mind right now, and particularly the deal that you were the point person on as you went over to Kyiv to actually first present it. We all watched what happened in the Oval Office. I guess the simple question is, can this deal be saved?
Well, David, the question is which deal, the peace deal or the economic deal, because clearly it's very difficult to do an economic deal with a leader who doesn't want to do a peace deal. And I will tell you, I was sitting 3 away from President Trump and President Zelensky, and this has to be one of the great diplomatic own goals in history.
If Mr. Zelensky called back right now and said, "I'm sorry, I want to put it back together," what would he have to do?
I don't know. Mr. Zelensky and his team were taken out of the Oval, and they kept coming back with that message, and then they left the White House, and it's going to take a lot of repair. And, you know, David, the real tragedy here, maybe things can be repaired with the administration, but I don't know how the American people are going to feel. And more importantly, the economic deal, the meeting today, the real purpose was to show that there was no daylight between the Americans and the Ukrainians. So, you know, President Trump's idea was to show that with the economic deals, to show that we're more intertwined, and that would be a symbol to the Ukrainian people, to Russian leadership, and to the American people. And President Zelensky blew that up today. I'm not sure what he was thinking.
As I say, you were the point person, really, for the administration on the economic deal. We all thought on the outside we were very close. In fact, I think many of us thought there'd be a signing today, that we'd have some form of economic deal today. Were we as close as those of us on the outside thought? Were you surprised?
Again, I was shocked that President Zelensky would come into the Oval Office, behave like this, speak to the president, speak to the vice president, but more importantly, disrespect the American people like this. I know he's under a great deal of stress. He and I had a very heated exchange in Kyiv. I think the same thing may have happened between him and Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio in Munich. And, you know, to come in and behave like this was unacceptable. And look, I mean, what better runway did he have that President of France, Emmanuel Macron, in the Oval on Monday? Yesterday, we had a fantastic meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer from the UK, and then President Zelensky today. I mean, you could not have asked for a better arc. And he walked in, and I'm not sure what he was thinking.
Many of us have been in heated negotiations, not at this level, but still heated negotiations where people pound the table, they may walk out the door and things like that, and it's actually part of the negotiation. Is that what we saw today, or was this a more fundamental rupture?
David, you don't do a negotiation with the President of the United States in public like this. That we were scheduled to have lunch afterwards, and that perhaps he could have brought up some of the points. Instead, he chose to let things go into a downward spiral on worldwide television. And, you know, again, I keep coming back to the disrespect of the American people. It was one thing for President Zelensky and I had an extended, heated negotiation in Kyiv, but we were going to get this economic agreement done. But, you know, when you bring it out to the public like this, we'll see if there's any coming back.
If there is further negotiation, do you expect to remain the point person on the economic deal?
I expect to be the point person on the economic deal, but ultimately it's going to be up to President Trump whether he thinks that he can continue negotiating with President Zelensky.
What is in it for Ukraine, the economic deal? Why is it in their best interest to sign this deal?
The economic deal is a fantastic deal because that, you know, if you think the U.S. is willing to co-join its economic interest with Ukraine, and like I said, a very, very strong symbol, potential for very high returns for Ukrainian people. And, you know, again, it was meant to be a very strong symbol to Russian leadership that the U.S. and Ukrainian people are more co-joined. And, you know, we have economic interest on the ground. Economic security becomes military security. The economy of Ukraine coming out of this, I thought our deal would have really been an accelerant to Ukrainian growth. I mean, you look at Poland next door, And since the Iron Curtain came down, when it came down, Poland and Ukraine had roughly the same size economies. Now Poland, before the war started, Poland's was 4 times larger. So Ukraine has a lot of potential. We'd hope to help unlock it. We'll see whether a deal can be done.
Would it be beneficial to Ukraine, though? I understand why it might benefit the United States. You've heard some people like Larry Summers said to me, this is sort of like Versailles, except that the Germans were the aggressors in World War I. These are the victims. Why should they give up natural resources? What's wrong with that argument?
Well, look, I think Professor Summers should comment on things where he has all the facts. And this is, Versailles was debt. This is equity. We get nothing if the Ukrainian people don't get anything. It's win-win. So there is no debt component here. Many of the European loans, or much of the European aid, has come in the form of debt. Thus far, U.S. has put in grants, and this is not debt. If it were debt, the Ukrainian bonds would not have been going up on the deal. So I think Mr. Summers, Professor Summers, should maybe call me and ask for the details before commenting. Maybe it's a nice media line that it's Versailles, but it's just not the truth.
You also have some other responsibilities besides trying to get an economic deal in Ukraine. Let's talk a little bit of the economy. And specifically, you and I have talked before, you have as a goal, as I recall, getting the deficit down to 3% of GDP in the United States. Saying it's going to take a little time to do it, not right away. What role does revenue from tariffs play in your spreadsheet when you look at getting to that 3% number?
Good, David, that's a great question, because over the coming weeks, months, as we put the budget together, your viewers are going